if I woke up tomorrow and like there was no evidence for a place called Nahom and no inscription with NHM on it or whatever, that evidence already would convince me that Nahom is somewhere in that general vicinity anyway, right? I think that like that's where it has to be. Not only is that the only place where you could have turned eastward or nearly eastward, like there's
Mormonism with the Murph, where Larry Singh explores church history and the church's truth claims. Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel, Mormonism with the Murph, where Larry Singh explores the church's history and the church's truth claims. And in today's interview, I will be interviewing Neal Rappleye, who is a scholar and a researcher on the Book of Mormon. Neal, thanks for joining me.
No problem. Thank you for having me on. Pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure. I'm really excited. So we're going to be talking about Book of Mormon. We're going to be talking about Book of Mormon sort of evidences, things in sort of like archaeology or geology, linguistics, which correlate with the Book of Mormon as evidence in favor for it. And then we're thinking of doing a part 2 because Neal's done some recent work on ancient metal plates in the ancient world and also responding to some of the criticisms leveled against the gold plates as well. And this has sort of been like new research. So this will be quite interesting. So we're really looking forward to this discussion. Neal, maybe for any people who don't know who you are, could you briefly maybe introduce yourself and anything about your background or research or involvement in scholarship and apologetics you want to talk about?
Yeah, sure. I guess where should I start? My name's Neal Rappleye. I work at Scripture Central, used to be called Book of Mormon Central. You can still find us at bookofmormoncentral.org.
And I'll just redirect you to Scripture Central.
Eventually, most of our content is still housed on bookofmormoncentral.org because we're still kind of working on building the Scripture Central website. But a lot of it is in both places right now. But in any case, you can go to bookofmormoncentral.org or scripturecentral.org and you can find us and you can find our content there. But I work as a researcher and a writer there. My main job for the last, I guess it's been 8 years, a little more than 8 years. Not my only job, but my main job in that time has been to work on the no why articles. We think we're cute and clever, so we call these things no whys. We smash no and why into one word.
And they're typically quite short, aren't they? I think aren't there no why videos as well, which are like a minute or two?
Yeah. So the idea when these were conceptualized, the idea was we wanted to take the massive body of scholarship that's been done on the Book of Mormon, and we wanted to make it a lot more accessible to people who aren't going to go read a 20-page article or a 30 or 40-page article or whatever, or even a whole book, right? An 800-page book or whatever. People who aren't going to dive in that deep, but are trying to get a little more out of their scripture study or whatever, we wanted to make this a lot more accessible to them. So we've taken it and we've broken things down into more bite-sized nuggets. The articles are usually, we put them on the web so they don't have pages, but I write them in a Word document and they usually come out to like 1.5 to 3 pages is probably about the average length. And then we have a video that's even shorter that kind of summarizes the main points of that. That's usually 1 or 2 minutes long. And so I've been doing, that's been my main job for the last 8 years is either writing those articles or supervising the research and writing of those articles from other people on our research team and kind of project managing them into from draft to being reviewed and vetted to getting published. And that has given me a lot of familiarity with the broad range of Book of Mormon scholarship and evidence and things like that. And in addition to that, I have kind of on the side, I've been doing some of my own research on various things. And I've published several papers, mostly in the Interpreter journal, which I assume you and your followers are already familiar with. A lot of it is on stuff in 1st and 2nd Nephi, the historical background of 1st Nephi and things like that. But I've also done some things on like the witnesses and the translation. I've dabbled a little bit in Mesoamerica, but not a lot.
Right.
And I've also published a few articles, a couple of things with BYU Studies. Koford Books had published an article of mine in their volume on what did they call it? Perspectives on Mormon Theology. And they did this series, or they were doing a series. They kind of stopped after just 2 books, but it was Perspectives on Mormon Theology, and they did a volume on apologetics, and I had a paper in there. So I've published with in a few different places, mostly an interpreter though. And so, yeah, I guess, I don't know. That's kind of who I am. I got into this mostly just out of my own self-interest, and I came home from my mission with questions. I think that's
Right.
a story a lot of people have, right? I came home from my mission in 2008, and I had, you know, I had served in the southern United States, eastern United States area in Virginia, and there's a lot of like anti-Mormon, that they call it the Bible Belt, because there's a lot of like evangelical anti-Mormon stuff. So I just came home with a lot of questions. I never had like a faith crisis. I don't have like a major faith crisis thing, but I wanted to be able to answer things when people asked me about them better than I could at the time. So that's kind of how I got started. And I got pretty serious about doing research, and I came to find I really liked it. I thought it was pretty cool. So
That's pretty awesome. And
yeah,
your wife as well, it's Jasmine, isn't it? I believe she also
yeah,
works for Book of Mormon Central or Scripture Central. I know she has a TikTok channel, and I think she has a YouTube channel about temples as well, which I think is really cool. I've watched some of
yeah.
her videos, and whenever I get onto the topic of looking at temples and connections like ancient temple rites, you'll have to put in a good word to her, and maybe I can do an episode with her about that because I find that fascinating. But that's kind of cool that you both get to research together.
Yeah, no, it's an absolute dream come true to be able to work together and research together and share this passion together, and to be able to have dinner conversations about this stuff, and I probably bore her a lot because I get into the weeds a little more
Mm.
often than she does, but nonetheless, it's been really great, and we both love it, and it's a lot of fun. So
Well, that's awesome. Well, you're someone who's, very knowledgeable scholar of many things to do with the Book of Mormon. So what we're going to talk about is maybe some of the strongest or main evidence, for the Book of Mormon, or just things which are interesting from research, which seems to correlate or be consistent with the Book of Mormon. And I also did, I'll just note this, a recent interview with Ryan Daly. I don't know if he's a colleague of yours. He's the
yeah,
manager, I think, at Evidence Central. I
yeah,
imagine that you're friends.
yeah.
And we did a similar episode looking at evidence for the Book of Mormon, and also talked a little about complexity as well. So that was also a good episode for listeners to go check out. And Ryan's a really nice guy as well.
Yeah, Ryan's great. Absolutely know him. We're in meetings together all the time. As part of our review and vetting process, I frequently review his stuff. He frequently reviews my stuff. I help contribute to Evidence Central when I have time. I haven't had time to do that for a while, and so he's probably mad at me about that. I don't know, but yeah, and he's helped contribute to No Wise as well. So yeah, I absolutely, Ryan's great, and I watched most of that episode you did with Ryan. I didn't watch the whole thing, and I know you've had like Brant Gardner on a lot too.
Yeah, I've had the privilege and opportunity to interview lots of different scholars because I did a big series on the Book of Mormon. It's funny, I've kind of finished my series, but I'm still gonna like interview people on the Book of Mormon because there's always so much more to talk
Sure.
about. But eventually I had to like move on to like other things as well. But I've interviewed Dan Peterson, Stephen Smoot, Blake Ostler, Brant Gardner like multiple times. He was on the show nearly every other episode. Brian Hales as well. And I've had even
Mhm.
critics like Dan Vogler,
Yeah,
Anthony Miller come on as well. So it's been good to talk to lots of different scholars and hear their different views and perspective on either historicity, geography, translation,
yeah,
those sorts of things. And there's always just so much more to learn as well. It's pretty cool.
absolutely.
Okay, so maybe we could start with Lehi in Jerusalem and the sort of like the historical and geopolitical context, 600 BC, and something that I found really interesting. I only learned about this since doing my channel. Was I read an article by Margaret Barker, who I
Uh-huh.
don't believe is a member of the church, but an Old Testament scholar, and she talked about like Josiah's reforms and that there being this ancient Israelite temple tradition of an atoning Messiah. I believe it was Yahweh, who is like son of the God Most High, and that there is also Asherah, who is this female consort of God, and all these things would have been there at the time. And when you have Lehi and Nephi talking about like a Messiah and to believe in Christ, a lot of critics will say, well, that's just an obvious anachronism or a 19th century element, but it actually sort of fits what was going on at that time period. Could you maybe talk a little bit about that? Clarify anything maybe I got wrong?
Sure. No, yeah, no. There's a lot going on there. Uh, that I do find very, very interesting, and in some cases compelling. This just kind of this overall setting and the way the Book of Mormon fits into it, and something I think like a lot of people I think gloss over this Jerusalem setting for things because it's I, I think people it's really easy to think, oh, Jerusalem, anyone in 1829 or whatever, in the 1820s, people knew about Jerusalem. It's in the Bible, and Joseph Smith could make up a story about something happening in Jerusalem. That's not hard. But what's kind of interesting to me, and I talked about this in a presentation I gave at FAIR in, I think, 2017. And I've since done a little more research on it and found even more. But so there's a collection of letters called the Amarna letters that are from Egypt, and they date to like 1400 BC or thereabouts, and they're a series of correspondence between kings in the Canaan or Palestine area and the Pharaoh, and they mentioned several cities, among them Jerusalem and things like that. And when scholars found them and started translating them, they were like, oh wow, we've got all this new information about this time period, and from the context of the letters and the details we have, it sounds like Jerusalem was a really significant political area, city-state at the time. It's got a king, it's got a palace, it's able to send like massive amounts of tribute to the pharaoh and stuff. And so they were expecting, like, if we dig into the archaeology there, we should find a big city dated to this time. And eventually they were able to do archaeology and dig down to the layer that would date to that time period, and they didn't find anything there. There was nothing. And the same thing happened with several other cities mentioned in the Amarna letters. And scholars, there's a lot of debate and discussion about what this means or what the implications are. But the reason I bring it up is I think it illustrates, like, you can't take for granted when you start making up a story or you start telling stories about something, you can't take for granted just because you know where it is and what it is, that it's going to conform to what we know archaeologically and historically as we learn more, right? It's been 200 years since the Book of Mormon was translated. And I find it fascinating that I think what the Book of Mormon says about Jerusalem in 600 BC checks out historically and archaeologically in ways that, like, authentic sources like the Amarna letters don't always, right? Because archaeology and written texts, they actually have a really complicated relationship. People don't fully appreciate all the time when they say, oh, let's try to find evidence and let's try to prove the Book of Mormon or whatever. Well, you have to understand how complicated it can be sometimes to see how a written source and archaeology relate, because we have authentic written sources that we know, we dug them out archaeologically, so we know they're authentic, but the information they have just doesn't match what we're able to find in the archaeological record. And so you have to understand how complicated that relationship can be sometimes. But yeah, there's actually, I think, a lot of things going on, some of which you talked about. Margaret Barker, she is indeed a non-Latter-day Saint scholar. She's over on your side of the pond. She's from the UK.
That's right. Yeah.
And she's done a lot of really, really interesting stuff. But one of the things that I think is actually pretty interesting as just part of this overall context, right, is there's evidence that Jerusalem was a pretty small city up until about 720-ish BC. And then there's like this mass influx of population there. And what happens is, what scholars believe happened anyway, is that when the Assyrian army came through and destroyed Samaria and the northern kingdom of Israel, a bunch of refugees fled down to Jerusalem and Judah.
Right.
And this created this influx of population. And then King Hezekiah has a wall built around the refugee camp where those people are. And so it gets incorporated formally into the city. And then archaeology tells us that that specific region where the refugees came, by the 7th century BC, it becomes actually a really wealthy, well-to-do neighborhood. We have, according to, I can't remember the exact passage in Jeremiah, but we have Jerusalem officials living in that area. And we have archaeology, we have seals that have been found in that area that confirm there were wealthy elites and officials living specifically in that area where the refugees had settled. And all of that is kind of interesting to me, because it tells us, in fact, Joseph Smith, the Book of Mormon was criticized because Lehi is a descendant of one of the northern tribes. He's a descendant of Joseph, we learn in 1 Nephi 5. And there were some, not everybody, but there were some people in the 19th century who were like, this is preposterous. It doesn't make sense, because Jerusalem is where the people of Judah were, and not all these other tribes, and those tribes had already been wiped out by the Assyrians. But no, there were a bunch of so we know now that there were actually a bunch of refugees from the northern kingdom, and that they had established themselves and become wealthy, socially elite citizens in Jerusalem at the time. And all of that's perfectly consistent with what we get from the Book of Mormon in these opening chapters, right? Lehi, who appears to be wealthy, he's got gold and silver and precious things. He's he can write, right? We know that him and his children can write, which is an elite skill. You're not going to be able to do that unless you're pretty well educated in that time period. And then we've got Laban, who is his kinsman, who's also from the tribe of Joseph. And Laban is some sort of official in the government and things like that. And so you've got all these details that we take for granted as we read the Book of Mormon sometimes. But archaeologically, this is all confirmed. This is consistent with what we know about Jerusalem at the time. Even the comments all the time from like Laman and Lemuel about how Jerusalem is a great city and it can't be destroyed. Well, if the Book of Mormon was taking place like 120 years earlier, Jerusalem would not have been a great city. It was a small, regional capital, according to the archaeology. But after that, it did. It became a really large city. Its population grew, like some people say, 3 to 4 times what it was before, and it had become, a prime city, is what archaeologists or scholars will call it, geographers will call it. And so this portrayal of Jerusalem with walls, the Book of Mormon mentions walls that fortified it, right? And the story from Emma that Joseph Smith is translating the text and he comes across walls in Jerusalem and he's like, oh my gosh, am I deceived? Are there really walls around Jerusalem? There were walls that fortified it that had only recently been built by King Hezekiah. And so we have this overall impression, this overall portrayal of the city itself that is consistent with archaeology. And like I said, I wouldn't say that's a huge evidence, but it's the kind of thing like I wouldn't take it for granted either, because the biblical portrayal of Jerusalem and things like that has been severely questioned by archaeology and by scholars as we've learned more. And other ancient sources, like I mentioned, like the Amarna letters, they don't necessarily have a clear and obvious correlation like, oh, it portrays the city as really robust and strong, and that's exactly what we see. So the fact that the way the Book of Mormon portrays Jerusalem appears to be consistent with what we know, and there's a few other things we could throw in there. Laban with his steel sword. Well, we found a steel sword, not we specifically, but a steel sword has been discovered from Judah, from the nearby Jericho, that dates right to the 600 BC. The writing on metals, which I guess we'll probably talk more about writing on metals later, but we know that they're writing on, that there are scribes who can engrave on metal in that time and place too, because we have the Ketep and Nahom inscriptions. We know they're writing in Egyptian at that time and place, because we've got tons of samples of what scholars call Palestinian hieratic. The samples are admittedly small, and the context, and we'll probably talk more about this when we go into
Reformed Egyptian later. Right. Yeah.
But the point is, all of these little details we have about people living in Jerusalem, we really can document this stuff, and we can document it all right to or very close to Lehi and Nephi's time. And then you get into some of the religious and political controversies that are going on that you mentioned. And this is where some of what Margaret Barker's talking about, right? There's these religious reforms where they're really trying to centralize what's going on. Like
right.
Josiah is trying to centralize the Israelite cult. That's kind of an academic way to talk about it, but the practice of Israelite religion to just within Jerusalem. And there are people who are resisting some of those reforms, and someone who's a descendant of refugees from the north, like Lehi is, that's a pretty natural, like, this kind of nationalistic Judah is the best and Judah is the true form of Israelite worship and stuff like that, and Jerusalem is the true center of Israel. That's the kind of thing that someone who's maybe coming from the north, a northern perspective, might not be totally on board with. And I'm not saying that Lehi and his family were totally opposed to Josiah's reforms, but there were probably elements of it that they didn't completely agree with, right? Like I like to relate it to like Latter-day Saints and Protestants. Like, do we completely disagree with Protestants or even Catholics or other Christians on absolutely everything? Well, no, of course not. No. But obviously there are some key points of disagreement. And I wrote a paper a while ago on Interpreter talking about some of those key points of where I think you see disagreement between Lehi and the reforms that Josiah is doing. And how they actually explain some of the tensions going on right within Lehi's family, right? And so, for instance, you have all these narratives about Laman and Lemuel wanting to kill either Nephi or Lehi or both. And we read that and we're like, oh my gosh, these guys are so wicked. They're psycho. They're psycho, and they're so murderous, and this is crazy. But in in Deuteronomy, and Deuteronomy was like the central text that was important to these reforms. It was,
Right.
According to the biblical narrative, the book of Deuteronomy had been discovered while they were, the book of the law, which most
Book of
scholars
Law.
assume was Deuteronomy, was discovered when they were doing some construction work repair work on the temple. And Josiah's like, oh my gosh, we haven't been living according to all the stipulations in this book, the covenant in this book. And so that's what initiates all these reforms. And in Deuteronomy like 13, it tells them, if there's a false prophet among you, you have to kill him. You need to stone him. You've got to kill him. And Lehi is making these prophecies, and Nephi makes prophecies that Laman and Lemuel don't accept as true, right? And so all these times where they're trying to kill them, it's because they think that he's a false prophet. They think Nephi and Lehi are false prophets. And so you have these social dynamics at play.
And there's also like prophets calling the people to repentance and prophets like fleeing from Jerusalem. Is that something that also fits the context of that time?
Yeah. So, 100%. So you have like, in the book of Jeremiah, it mentions the prophet Urijah, who we don't know a lot about what his message and stuff was, but he was wanted for treason for what he preached. And so he fled to Egypt, and there was actually a garrison that went out to Egypt and found him and brought him back, and he was executed, right? And so that's in the book of Jeremiah. But then you also have like the Lachish letters, which date right to like 580 or 590 BC or somewhere thereabout. It's like they date right to before the destruction of Jerusalem by Jerusalem and Lachish and all of those areas. And in there, they talk about a prophet who had been warning the people and had fled, and they were trying to go to Egypt to find him and things like that. So, yeah, you have this broader context where, and Jeremiah obviously is one of the prophets who he never flees, but his life is in danger a couple of times. He gets thrown in prison. So, yeah, you have this broader context there, and things like so. You have this idea, like the Book of Mormon opens right with Lehi having this vision, right, where he sees God surrounded by
concourses of angels, right? Yeah,
and then one descends and shows him a book and all of this stuff, and this is where this is what scholars call a divine council scene or a throne theophany, which is usually accompanied. It's part of a divine council scene, and this is something that was kind of controversial at the time, but prophets like Jeremiah, he talks about how like in Jeremiah's conflicts with false prophets like Hananiah and stuff like that, he talks about how the true prophets are the ones who have stood in the counsel of the Lord and have seen and heard the Lord's counsel, right? And this is exactly what Lehi says happened, right? He uses this expression seen and heard all the time to talk about his revelations. And he has this vision, and so Nephi, by making that the opening scene, he's clearly using criteria that were directly relevant to that time period to establish my father was among the true prophets. But one of the controversies that was part of these reforms is the idea that God could not actually be seen. And
right.
There's Margaret Barker talks about it. Other people have also made this argument that in the book of Deuteronomy, there appears to be some editing that's been done when referring back to the Sinai incident on Mount Sinai.
Where Moses saw God face to face.
Right, where in Exodus, Moses saw God face to face. But in Deuteronomy, I can't remember the exact passage, but it says, you heard a voice, but you saw no form, or something to that effect, right? And so the way they're telling the story in Deuteronomy, and some scholars think the whole book of Deuteronomy is just a forgery that was made at the time of Josiah's reforms. I think we don't have to take that extreme position, but it may have been edited by supporters of those reforms and things like that.
Right.
So, and in fact, there's a passage in Jeremiah where he talks about, I can't remember the exact reference. I'm sorry, I'm talking about a bunch of the stuff and I don't have exact references for you. Everyone listening is going to be like, this guy's just making it up. But there's a passage in there about scribes and the lying pen that scholars think might have been referring to the Deuteronomists making edits to the book of Deuteronomy and attributing things to Moses for the sake of establishing authority. But in any case, so there's this idea that in the Deuteronomist worldview, you're not supposed to be able to see God. And so Lehi's vision kind of runs counter to that. And so again, then you have Laman and Lemuel, they're accusing him of being a visionary man, right?
Right.
And this is, Matt Roper actually did the research on this, but this is a pejorative in the Hebrew. The Hebrew, the likely underlying Hebrew terminology there is a pejorative for a seer or visionary, right? And so you have all these different things, and we could go through the whole book of First Nephi this way. That's what I did in my paper, right? Where in all of the different conflicts between Laman and Lemuel and Lehi and Nephi, what appears to be at the center of that conflict is the things going on in these reforms. And Laman and Lemuel, we think of them as these wicked dudes, but in First Nephi 17, they specifically say, hey, we believe in the law of Moses, and we believe the people at Jerusalem are living by the law of
Righteous.
Moses.
Yeah.
Right? They're righteous and they're living by the law of Moses. And that would be true from a Deuteronomist perspective. And so Laman or Lehi and Nephi, obviously, they disagree with that. And so you can see how when you go through the whole book of First Nephi, all of these tensions can be explained by some of these issues that are specifically in conflict. And even like Lehi going out to the wilderness to have his vision, like it's wilderness prophets and these wilderness shrines where people would go to have religious experiences are being destroyed through this reform process. And you have, I wish I could remember it off the top of my head, but you have like a combination of things at these wilderness shrines that you actually find. Oh, it's not all specifically in Lehi's first vision, but then Lehi goes out into the wilderness, right? They go to the Valley of Lemuel and he builds an altar. And in his first vision, it says that a pillar of fire came down upon a rock, right? Yep. And what is that rock? Well, a lot of these wilderness shrines just consisted of a stone that had been set up vertically, right? And they call them, I think they're called a maseba. I might be saying that wrong. That's the Hebrew word for it, though. It's usually translated stone. I don't know if a Hebrew scholar might disagree with using the word rock to translate it. I think that's just a semantic issue, though. So Lehi goes out into the wilderness. He seems to be praying at like a rock, maybe one of these wilderness shrines. And then he goes out into the Valley of Lemuel, where he builds an altar, which is another common, like an unhewn altar of stone, which is another common feature of like these wilderness shrines, where he offers sacrifices outside Jerusalem, which again, that Deuteronomy 12 is the text that kind of says, oh, you're not supposed to do that. Right? But you have in Genesis and even Exodus, right? You have the patriarchs and you have the Israelites doing that all the time. And especially if you understand that Lehi and Nephi are conceptualizing themselves as leading a new Exodus, then they're going to see this as perfectly acceptable behavior. And then the other feature that's common in these wilderness shrines is actually a tree that is thought to symbolize, like, the tree of life and things like that. And of course, it's in the Valley of Lemuel where Lehi has this dream where he sees the tree of life. And the whole vision of Lehi's vision of the tree of life can be interpreted through this lens, where you have the large and spacious building, which some people have suggested could be the Jerusalem temple run by a corrupted priesthood. The people, the Deuteronomists, the reformers who are supporting Josiah are in the great and spacious building and being the Solomon's temple, right? And you have out in the wilderness, you have the prophets going to a wilderness shrine where there's a sacred tree. You kind of have, again, that juxtaposition. And so that's all off the cuff, general details, at least. In the specifics, I might want to, if you really grilled me, there might be some specifics I'd want to caveat there. But there's just a lot of interesting ways in which when you just understand the conflicts going on in Jerusalem at that time, the things going on in the Book of Mormon and the social dynamics and the tensions within their family all start to make a lot of sense. They all center right on some of these key issues, these key theological issues for people at that time. And then, of course, I haven't even talked about the Messiah stuff, which you mentioned. And
well, it's funny. I just had this thought that came to my head, and this could be completely wrong. When you said about the great and spacious building, the people on there could have been sort of like the priesthood in Jerusalem, sort of like mocking the believers. Well, we would interpret that the fruit of the tree represents God's love, which is manifested in Jesus Christ. And if you have Lehi trying to preach about an atoning Messiah and they're rejecting that, that almost sort of like links in a way. But yeah, maybe you could talk a little about that, because the Book of Mormon, it talks about like plain and precious truths, being taken from the book. And I always grew up and interpreted that as that's after the Bible was completed, that this removal of plain and precious truth was occurring. But it seems like with the Deuteronomist and Josiah's reforms that this is something that might have been taking place in Lehi and Nephi's time and day.
Yeah, well, yeah, and in the visionary context of Nephi's vision in First Nephi 13 and all of that, it is portrayed as what's happening after like the canon is closed and all of that, right after the Bible's written. But all of this, that's exactly like it would have resonated with Nephi. One of the big things for me, at least, because my training and background is in history, and so I think in historical terms a lot. And so when I'm looking at stuff that's supposed to be prophetic and about the future, what I'm trying to understand is how would this have made sense to someone in that context and in that time and place. And one of the things, one of the reasons lots of scholars will be skeptical of prophetic stuff, right, is because it's like if you're prophesying way far into the future like Nephi does, how is it going to be relevant to you? And how is it going to, like, what would it even mean to the person receiving that revelation and receiving that prophecy and their audience? And so that's one of the questions I like to think about and I probe. And there's been a lot of actually really recent work on ways in which Nephi's grand sweeping vision would have been interpreted and would have made sense to him as living in 600 BC. But one of those things is this idea that, yeah, he sees in vision future corruption of Scripture, but that's going to resonate with him because he's witnessed it in his own time and place, and he's seen the corruption and the removal of plain and precious things happening right there in his own time and place as these reforms are going on. And this idea of a Messiah, what I think is actually really interesting. So as a title, Messiah would be used to refer to the Israelite king, right? There would have been all this liturgy around who the king was and what his role was in ancient Near Eastern societies. And lots of scholars have gone through like the Psalms and stuff like that to try and piece together what was the Israelite ideology around the king. And that's what Margaret Barker's doing a lot of with her stuff on like the idea of an atoning Messiah and all of this stuff. Is they're trying to piece together. We didn't get a formal text that lays out the full ritual liturgy of kingship for the Israelites. But when you look at the Psalms and some of the biblical texts and you put it in context with things we've learned about other ancient Near Eastern stuff, you can start to piece together these ideas that like the Messiah, the king as the Messiah was regarded as the Son of God. He was like the literal embodiment of Yahweh, or we usually translate that as Jehovah, who was the God of Israel in this pantheon. And that might seem a little radical to some people to be talking about a pantheon among the Israelites, right? But
right.
There are different biblical texts and variants of those texts in like the Dead Sea Scrolls and stuff like that. And then the broader ancient Near Eastern context that suggests to us, that suggests to scholars of the Bible, and I find their arguments persuasive, that there's this pantheon and that Yahweh at some points, and it's not a monolithic thing, right? Obviously we're talking about how there's these Deuteronomists and Lehi and Nephi disagree with them and stuff. So it's not a monolithic thing. People may have had different arrangements, but there's some evidence that at least for some people, the idea was there's this pantheon and Yahweh is the God of Israel within that pantheon. And there's other national deities. And then there's
they weren't completely monotheistic. They would have worshipped Yahweh, would have acknowledged the existence of other deities, other gods.
Exactly. And all of those deities are sons of the Most High God, right? And the Most High God being El or Elohim, right? This is Latter-day Saints some Latter-day Saint scholars at least have really latched onto this, because it's you start hearing this and you're like, that sounds a lot like what Joseph Smith said, right?
Well, yeah, it sort of is very similar to our own theology about
exactly
Jesus, Jehovah, the God of the Old Testament, but he is the Son of God, atoning Messiah, son of Heavenly Father, who is Elohim to us. And then Asherah as well, being like this consort of God, that she would have been in Israelite temples depicted often as like a tree of life as well. But I believe that was removed with Josiah's reforms as well, viewed as like an idol. So it's very interesting on how that can connect to the tree of life as well, and the vision of the tree of life.
No, absolutely. And it's all just like I said, some Latter-day Saint scholars and I find all of it very interesting too. I think there's some people who've kind of pushed the the argument a little too far and have gone a little further than I think we can. But I do think there's some smoke there, if you will, and where there's smoke, there's often fire, right? Like I find it really compelling the way it all seems to come together. But
would you be tentative? Because I think I listened to a interview on, I think it was The Stick of Joseph, and they interviewed a guy, I can't remember his name, but he was basically implying that Jesus was edited out of the Old Testament. And I think he probably alluded to as well this ancient Israelite temple tradition and this atoning Messiah, and perhaps he was added out. Would you be more tentative, with that? Or what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, well, so the way I would describe it is I would say that there were ideas about the Messiah. There were messianic ideas that were excluded from the canon in some way, shape, or form. And some of that may have happened through kind of an editing process. Some of it may have just happened through selective choice of what to preserve and what not to preserve. But there are some relevant messianic ideas that were left out. And it's left scholars kind of with this void. Like I said, when it comes to trying to figure out, another way to talk about it would be like the royal ideology, or the ideology around the king. Because like I said, Messiah would have been understood as the king, the anointed king of Israel. And we don't know. We don't have their full liturgy of that. We don't fully know what the Israelites' ideology around kingship was. And so there's been selectively omitting some kind of process that omitted ideas about who the Messiah was supposed to be and what the Messiah was supposed to do, that have made it a lot harder to piece things together. And that's kind of Margaret Barker's whole thing, all her books and everything. What she's trying to do is she's trying to piece it together by using different things in the Bible and then different things in non-biblical texts that are nonetheless Jewish and other ancient Near Eastern contexts. And she's trying to piece together, what did the Israelites actually believe about the Messiah? So it's different than saying Jesus literally is being edited out, though, because my understanding of it from all the reading I've done, and this is still an area where like I kind of feel like I'm still doing research and figuring some things out, but I see it as there's this messianic typology, and the Israelites associate that with their king, right? And so all the things that the Old Testament says about the Messiah and all of the things that they would have had about the Messiah that was left out of the Old Testament, they understood the king as fulfilling that. And you can see a similar thing going on in places like Egypt and Mesopotamia, where every new king is ritually anointed king and pronounced the son of God. And I think it's in Egypt, and I might be getting some of the details wrong because I don't have it, all the details down, but my understanding is that the Pharaoh in Egypt was understood to have would go through a ritual where it was understood he has now died, gone down into the underworld, and then he conquers the demons or the gods of the underworld, right? And he resurrects and comes off victorious. And whenever, when Ramses is king or whoever, right, the worldview, the belief of the Egyptians is he's the one who literally did that. But then when he dies and his son becomes king, now it's like, okay, that's the Pharaoh, and he's the one who literally did that, right? And so you have this ideology about the king, and that person is literally believed to be your Messiah, the one who's going to save you or whatever, and who's going to conquer the forces of chaos and restore order in the world. And he's going to do it as the embodiment of God himself, of the God of Israel. So in Israel, it would be the king is the son of God. He's the embodiment of Yahweh. And there was probably some kind of ritual, ceremonial reenactment of creation and conquering the forces of chaos, where the king would suffer and atone in some way and then come off victorious. And your common Israelite would have associated that with whoever the living king was at the time. And I think we understand that what Lehi starts doing, you can see why this becomes a really dangerous thing for him and the people want to kill him, because he comes out and he says, actually, there's going to be a future Messiah, and he's the one who's actually going to do all that stuff.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
That's like, if you're Zedekiah, right, you're the king at the time, that's treason. That is, no, I'm the Messiah. I'm the king. I'm the one who has conquered I'm the embodiment of Yahweh. I'm the one who's conquered the forces of evil. I am the one who who is going to fulfill all the future expectations of the Messiah as well. It's me. I'm the Messiah. But what happens is Lehi gets this revelation, and the first thing he learns is that Jerusalem will be destroyed and captives will be carried off into Babylon. So he knows now, okay, the current king is that the royal line is going to cease. It's going to stop, right? The city is actually going to be conquered. It's going to be destroyed. No more Davidic king. No more, Zedekiah is not going to save us. No one's going to save us. And so then the next thing he learns, which goes hand in hand with that, is, okay, the actual Messiah, the one who's going to fulfill everything you guys have been expecting from your Messiah, your king, is going to come in the future, right? And so those two things, they actually go hand in hand. And once you put those two things together, like I said, suddenly you understand, okay, this is why the Jews at Jerusalem want to kill Lehi. He's basically committing treason by saying Zedekiah is not our Messiah. He's not the one who's going to fulfill all the messianic expectations that we have. So yeah, that's kind of, that goes beyond anything.
That's a lot more context to what's going on.
Yeah, and I mean, I'd like to, that's something, like I said, that's something I'm still kind of fleshing out my own understanding of all of that. And so again, caveats, a lot
more complex.
There's more complexity. There's probably some fine details I will adjust in the future, but that is something I hope to flesh out at some point, is how these messianic ideas in the Book of Mormon relate to what's going on in the historical context there. And they do, right? They do gain this prophetic knowledge of exactly who the Messiah is. And that might seem unusual to us. They learn that it's going to be this man named Jesus who's going to come 600 years later. And they get this, Nephi gets this full vision of everything that's going to happen. But the conceptual ideas, I think, of what the Messiah is and what he's going to go through and how all that relates, I think that's all there. The blueprint for it, if you will. It's all there in 600 BC.
Because you often see critics would point to, like, talking about Jesus and him being like the savior, and they knew about him 600 years, before he was born, before the Jews, and it's nowhere in the Old Testament that this is an obvious 19th century element or anachronism. And then when you look at this ancient atoning Messiah tradition, maybe if it wasn't explicitly about Jesus, you're like, well, it's not maybe necessarily is that a clear 19th century element or anachronism.
The ideas themselves, like I said, the conceptual blueprint for it all is there. And once you have that, I can't prove that revelation happens, right? I can't do that. But once you have the blueprint there, you can see how God could have spoken to them after the manner of their own language to understand who Jesus was going to be, and understand, like, okay, we have this expectation of a Messiah who's going to come, he's going to suffer and atone for us, and he's going to conquer death and destruction and chaos. And then God's able to say, yeah, let me show you exactly when and how that's going to happen for your benefit, because you're going away from this area. How else are they going to know or be able to have faith in it in the future? Because it's not going to happen among their own people. So I kind of see it as God is giving more explicit revelation to Lehi and Nephi, precisely because of the way they're going to be separated from the Holy Land itself and never be able to return. And so in order to like be able to still have faith that this is all going to come to pass and they can put their trust
dwindle in unbelief.
Right. Yeah. Not dwindle in unbelief. They need to know a little more explicitly what the plan is, right? What's going to happen.
I think it's Jacob who learns the name of Christ, and then I think King Benjamin as well, is visited by, I think, an angel, and he tells the people things about that. So that's all really fascinating. We could probably talk about this for so long. Why don't we jump to Arabian geography, talk a little about Nahom and Bountiful. You've done a lot of work on that. Most people probably be familiar with that. Some people might view this as smoking gun bullseye. Other people might say, well, seems like plausible evidence. I think it converges very well, the whole travel through the Arabian desert. Nahom, they find NHM on an altar, near a burial site in Yemen, and then them turning eastward towards Bountiful. And there's a couple of locations that look very plausible for Bountiful. And it seems like this seems very, at least, consistent with Old World Arabian geography. And it appears that Joe Smith wouldn't have known about this. And maybe you could talk about that in a little bit more depth about Nahom and Bountiful and the travel through the Arabian desert. And does this seem to line up with the Book of Mormon?
Yeah, I mean, sure. So, I mean, I certainly think it does. And for a little bit of context there, this is actually something I was first exposed to this idea in like 9th grade, my seminary teacher, I grew up in Utah. We didn't go that much into my background, but I'm pretty much your stereotypical Mormon. I grew up in Utah. I had in a big family, and we were all active the whole time and stuff like that. But and so seminary for me was during school, and I went to seminary class, and my teacher read this thing in the back of the Ensign about it, and I was like, my little 14-year-old brain was just like, whoa, that seems crazy. And then like I like vaguely remembered it years later when I was on my mission, and people would challenge me, and I would kind of bring it up, and they'd be like, oh, that's not very persuasive. And admittedly, like the garbled memory I had of it really wasn't very persuasive. Like,
you're like, I think there's this altar with NHM on it. And,
yeah, it was.
It's
and
Nahom.
people were like, gee whiz, like. And so that was actually something when I came home, I was like, I want to learn more about that, and I want to know, like, is it really persuasive evidence or not? And I think for what it's worth, I know there's like a lot of people think apologists are just like these biased, dishonest, deceptive people, but
pseudo scholars.
Yeah, pseudo scholars. My own experience, speaking for myself, and my experience with a lot of other people, I'm in a lot of social circles with other people who are doing research on this stuff and whatnot. Most of the stuff I research is stuff that I have a question about it and I want to know. And my testimony isn't necessarily hanging in the balance when I do this research. If something doesn't pan out and doesn't turn out to be persuasive evidence, like I just, for me, and I've had lots of dead ends where that's turned out to be the case. It's just kind of like, oh, well, all right, that one, that didn't really pan out. And so when I started digging into this, I really wanted to know, like, is there actually something interesting and compelling here, or not? And so I've got a few different papers on this, and I have another one. I don't know when this will actually air. I don't know when you'll be putting this live, but I have
probably in the next couple of weeks, I'd say.
Yeah, I have another paper that'll come out early 2024 on this. That's gonna lay out in the most detailed way I could everything I think about this, basically. But
maybe you could give us the wee nutshell version.
Yeah, let me just try and break it down. That was a lot of buildup, and we don't need to take that long, I guess. But
and we've talked about Nahom and Bountiful. I've done it in my own episodes, and we've certainly talked about it with different scholars. But I think you're the one who's probably recently done a lot more research and analysis into it.
Yeah. So I think one of the things you gotta start with this fact that in the Book of Mormon, in First Nephi, all of the place names, and I'm sure you know this, you've heard this before, but all of the place names are explicitly said to be names that Lehi or his family gave to the place.
Yes.
Right. Except Nahom, right? Where you have Ishmael died and was buried in the place which was called Nahom. And something that I don't think gets pointed out often enough is almost all of the naming of places takes place in First Nephi 16 and 17, the first few verses of 17. The only exception is in First Nephi 2:8, you have Lehi saying that he called the name of the river Laman. But even the Valley of Lemuel is mentioned in chapter 16, verse 6, the valley which he called Lemuel. Verse 13, we called the name of the place Shazer. And then in chapter 17, verse 5, the land which we called Bountiful, which we called Iriantum, the sea which we called Iriantum. All of that is happening within a few verses of Nahom. And then you have this one verse where the wording's different. And it's this place which was called Nahom. And I think it's worth pointing out, this hasn't been pointed out terribly often, I don't feel like. But even before we knew that there was a place called Nahom, right? Hugh Nibley, actually, in Lehi in the Desert, in his 1950 study in Lehi in the Desert that was published serially in the Improvement era, he's pointing out that there's a difference here, that all these other places, they're named by Lehi and his family, and he points out, he has a whole chapter on how that's, or a whole section of a chapter on how that's a common practice among the Bedouin in the desert to stop at different camps and name it after your traveling companions and things like that. And so that's a really authentic looking practice. But then you have this difference. Nibley himself points out, he says, note that this is not a place which we called Nahom, but the place which was so called a desert burial ground. So Nibley is already pointing out in 1950, he doesn't know about any place called NHM. He doesn't know about any altars, but he's noticing this difference and he's pointing it out. And then in 1976, you have Lynn and Hope Hilton. They also point out, this was in the Ensign in September 1976, one campsite Nahom must have been a settled place because Nephi says it was called Nahom, and every other campsite they named themselves. And they also did not know about any place with an NHM name or whatever, right? And so
Right.
this is not, some people have misconstrued this online and stuff and said, oh, this is people interpreting that passage that way after they found the evidence for a place called that. And that's not true. Latter-day Saint scholars were already noticing this distinction and being like, huh, that's interesting. And then the Hiltons also, what's really striking about them, already with Nibley is also the first person to suggest that Lehi is following the frankincense trail. Right. So we have this idea that there's a name in the text that maybe is coming from an outside source. And so it can potentially be found in historical sources, but we have to, before we jump to, let's go find it on a map and then say that's Nahom. And some people skip this step, but we do have to take a step back and say, where should we find it based on what the text says, right? And
whereabouts should it be according to the text
should it be
and the travel directions?
And this is where you get, some people when talking about it have been like, it is right where Nephi says it should be. And people have, understandably been like, oh, you can't know that. And it's true. Like Nephi did not record, like it's right at the GPS coordinates of blah, 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 right? And if he did, we would have thought that was incredibly anachronistic. And, there's, so obviously he didn't give us that, but he gave us directions. And he described their journey, right? And so he tells us they go down by the Red Sea. He tells us they travel in a south-southeast direction. And every time he mentions their continued directions, he mentions that they're still going in that direction until they get to Nahom. And then after Ishmael's death and burial, he says we went nearly eastward from that time forth. And of course, that's when they arrive at Bountiful, right? And again, I know this is all stuff that you've probably been through with other people already, stuff and whatnot.
No, this is good.
We have to understand that detail because those directions are what tell us where to look, where we should be looking. And it's, like I said, Nibley already it wasn't in his 1950 Lehi in the Desert study, but when he did an approach to the Book of Mormon in 1957, he said that, he talked about the trade route there, and he said that this is the route Lehi took when he escaped from Jerusalem. So he didn't have the specific details of the route itself. The scholarship on the frankincense trail was kind of in its infancy in the 1950s and 60s. And so he didn't have the specifics of the route itself, but he had the general outline, and he's like, yeah, that's the route Lehi's following. That's the exact same directions he's following. And then the Hiltons come along in the 1970s, and they more thoroughly make the argument Lehi is following the frankincense trail. And they base it on, what they understand of the frankincense trail at the time. And so they kind of reconstruct Lehi's route based on the sources they had access to in the 1970s and stuff like that. But they said something specific in their book, In Search of Lehi's Trails, published in 1976. Again, no Latter-day Saint at least has found anything referring to Nahom or Nahom or NHM yet. But they said, based on their study and their correlation of things to the frankincense trail, they said the locale of Nahom would be in the area where the frankincense trail is known to have turned eastward. They said that. So we already have, before anyone's made this correlation, we already have people recognizing that Nahom is probably a place.
This is the rough area it would have to be.
And the rough area it would have to be is where the frankincense trail turns eastward. Now, like I said, their model for Lehi's trail is based on the scholarship they had access to. And I wouldn't follow their exact route anymore, but that's because I have access to more recent and contemporary studies on the frankincense trail. But we can go to like non-LDS scholarship that's been done on the frankincense trail and reconstructed that route. And I've done that. I've looked at, I've read Nigel Groom's book on frankincense and myrrh, and he reconstructs the trail. And that was in the 1980s. So that comes after the Hiltons, right? He's kind of the one who really kicked off serious research on the frankincense trade, and kind of provides the first like really detailed attempt at reconstructing the route. And there's other scholars who've come along since and done things to reconstruct it. But the overall course of the frankincense trail basically mirrors the directions that we get from Lehi. It goes in this, it's got this long kind of south-north leg, right? That's angled at a southeast-northwest kind of direction. And then you get down to northern Yemen, and then you have a branch out eastward or east along an east-west axis. And Some scholars will reconstruct it so that it doesn't go all the way to the coast of the Dhofar area. Other scholars do reconstruct a trail going all the way to the Dhofar area. We have documentation of the existence of camel trails and things like that that do make that connection. And so you already have, like I said, if you follow that scholarship, the most up-to-date scholarship on where the frankincense trail turns eastward, it puts you down in the area in Yemen it's referred to as the Wadi Jaf. It's this big giant valley, Wadi being valley, and Jaf I think just means like opening or gap or whatever. And so you've got the mountains going along the coast, right? And there's this big opening, this big gap on that eastern side of the mountains where there's this large valley. And so that's called the Wadi Jaf. And that is the area. There's a couple of different trails. And so when it comes to like, it's not like there's only one path to walk. The whole frankincense trail is like a system or network of trails, right? But it has this general directionality, right? From what I've been able to document, there's basically 3 different trails in that area, depending on exactly where you are, where you could branch out eastward from there. But it's in that general vicinity is where the trails of the frankincense trade, and it's not just frankincense, they're trading other goods too, obviously, but the main roads in that caravan trade turning east are all kind of around that area within a few dozen miles of the Wadi Jaf, right?
Right.
And so that evidence alone, like I personally, if I woke up tomorrow and like there was no evidence for a place called Nahom and no inscription with NHM on it or whatever, that evidence already would convince me that Nahom is somewhere in that general vicinity anyway, right? I think that like that's where it has to be. Not only is that the only place where you could have turned eastward or nearly eastward, like there's a few trails further north that go northeast that branch off from the other trail going, northwest, southeast, that go northeast to cross over into Mesopotamia or whatever. But to go like nearly eastward, you have to get down to that area in northern Yemen. And also the only trail
only sort of place area that would have happened that you could go eastward.
Yeah, exactly. And there's a massive desert that basically makes going straight eastward impossible before you get to this point.
Right.
And then of course there's the issue, you also have to factor in the fact that nowhere else, no other trail goes eastward and leads right to a place that fits the description of Bountiful, right? And again, Hugh Nibley already in the 1950s is pointing out that the Dhofar coast has like this rich fertility, and he's like documenting examples of late 19th century travelers who traveled there and were shocked by how green and fertile it is in that area after traveling through the desert. And he's like, this sounds just like Lehi and Nephi and their family when they get there, and they're like, wow, look at all this, the fruit and the honey and all of this stuff. This is amazing. And so Nibley already, the Hiltons already are putting Bountiful, exact locations of where Bountiful is, right? There's been some debate. You've got Warren Aston arguing for Khor Kafot, and you've got George Potter arguing for Khor Rory, but they're both in the Dhofar area, and that area is already established, right? Yeah, that area is already established as the most likely place, even only place for Bountiful by Hugh Nibley and the Hiltons, again, before we know where any place called Nahom is. So, like I said, if I woke up tomorrow and there was no evidence for a place called Nahom specifically, I still would be convinced, just based on that evidence alone, that Nahom has to be in this area where those trails branch out eastward and lead to Dhofar. That's the only place it could be. And so that's why it becomes really striking and quite compelling that there is a place there with a name NHM, right? And it gets spelled a lot of different ways. The maps where it was first discovered on it spell it Nehem, Nehem, or Nehhm. Scholars today will more commonly spell it Nihim, Nihm. But I've been told
the name of the tribe in the area, Nihim.
Yeah. So it's the name of both this region and a tribe there. In fact, it's the name of the tribal territory, right? And so the tribe lives there, and their area is named after them. And then there's, when modern states developed and Yemen becomes a former, a modern state, they form this bureaucratic apparatus and they put a district that roughly corresponds with that tribal area, and they officially call the district Nehem, right? but maps going back to like the mid 1700s have Nehem, Nehm, or Nehhm, or Hem, however, it's spelled a variety of different ways. Other maps, early 20th century, it was a particularly popular or common to spell it with an A, so Naham or Nahom. And you even have, you've got scholars who are spelling it that way in the mid 20th century.
Because there's no vowels in that ancient Semitic script.
Yeah, there's no vowels in the ancient Semitic writing. So scholars are kind of filling in the vowels, and the rules, I don't know all the details on this, but the rules for transliterating Arabic names changed in like the 1960s or 70s or 80s. They adopted a new standardized method for transliterating those vowels. And that's when the shift came, and it became standardized as Nihim, right? So, but it's spelled a variety of different ways. In fact, if you go on Google, like Google Maps right now, and you go to that area, you'll see it listed as for Naham with Naham, right? And so the exact spelling varies. I actually document in the paper I'm doing, I document like 19 different ways it's been spelled or something like that. 17 or 18, 19, I can't remember exactly. But it's spelled a variety of different ways. I don't think, determining that Nahom can't be an authentic spelling of that name. Like, I don't think you can realistically rule that out as just like an attempt to represent this name in English, right? And so there is this place, and you can trace it historically. By the way, I think something that gets lost in these discussions sometimes, like when biblical scholars and archaeologists are doing biblical geography, they use modern Arabic toponyms to try and identify potential biblical sites. And if there's an Arabic toponym that sounds similar to a biblical name, they'll say, hey, that might be that biblical place. And then they'll do all the other research to see if it fits or whatever.
Is it in the right sort of area, right location, right time?
They use modern Arabic toponymy to help them do that. And there's lots of places where
they wouldn't have the vowels either.
Right. And so this idea that we have a modern name in Arabia that is similar, that's exactly how biblical archaeologists and scholars are identifying biblical sites in a lot of cases. And they can't trace the Arabic name back into biblical times and prove that it's had that same name the whole time. But they assume, like, okay, it's got a similar name to the Bible, and we have all these other details that correlate. So this is probably a preservation of that name through time. But with Nehem, we can actually trace it first through early Islamic sources, going back to like the very beginning of Islam in the 7th century AD, when Muhammad and Islam first spreads down into the Yemen area. There's like a covenant treaty that's formed, and all of the tribes in the area convert to Islam, and Nehem is listed as one of those tribes. And so we know it's there basically in pre-Islamic times, because they didn't like just poof out of nowhere as soon as Islam arrived, right? So they exist and they're established, and what we can piece together geographically from these early Islamic sources is they're in the same approximate location. Their exact tribal boundaries fluctuated. And actually, I just published a paper with BYU Studies. In this paper, you'll get some people who make a big deal about whether it's a tribe or a place name. So I have a paper that just came out in BYU Studies like a month ago, or maybe 2 months ago, I don't know, that talks about the relationship between tribes and place names in Yemen. I actually show how the geography of these early Islamic sources places the Nehem tribe in the same place. And I show a map that's based on one particular early Islamic source that shows they actually had 2 territories at the time, one in the same location and one a little further north, but they were still just one tribe, and their territory in general is still referred to as Nehem, right?
Right. And the Nehm sorry to interrupt you, inscription on the altar, I believe it's at a burial site or a cemetery. Is that correct? And that would almost align with the text of the Book of Mormon when they bring Ishmael there to bury him. He was buried at a place called Nahom.
Yeah. So yeah, we have these historical sources, like I said, that allow us to trace it back to pre-Islamic times, and then we have these inscriptions. Most people know about these altar inscriptions that represent or mention their author being a Nehemite, right? That's the word that's there. It's NHMYN is how it gets transliterated. The Y is like, if you talk about like people groups today, you might refer to an Israeli, right, with an I on the end. It's the same kind of thing going on all the way back into antiquity. You have, or a Yemeni, right? Someone from Yemen is a Yemeni. We translate it as "ite" lots of times, and then the "n" at the end is just it's the definitive article, so it's like the word "the" being affixed to it. So it basically, the inscription says this guy is the Nehemite, or the Nehemi, if you will. And so those were found in Marib at a temple site, and they were dated to about the 7th century BC. So they kind of are the grand evidence that kind of seals it and says, yep, this goes all the way back to the time period of Lehi. And there are actually several other inscriptions. We don't talk about them as much, but there are several other pre-Islamic inscriptions that use this term, this Nehemi or Nehemite term, and allow us to document a little bit more about the tribe. And people, again, they've made a big deal about, oh, is it a tribe? Is it a place? If you, and I document this in my paper, you read the literature, that what scholars are actually saying about these altars. Sometimes they'll say, this is a person from the tribe of Nehem. Sometimes they'll say, this is a person from the region of Nehem. And when you understand, like, first of all, tribal names are used as territorial names all the time in Yemen. And this goes all the way back to the pre-Islamic inscriptions. They're being used as the names of kingdoms and lands and territories all the time. They refer to tribal names in this toponymic way. And then you also have, just have the fact that a person's association with their tribe linked them to that territory as well, just in the ideology of the way these people thought. And I've got quotes from scholars in my BYU studies paper. But the cemetery, that's what you were asking about.
Yes.
The inscriptions themselves are not directly found in a burial ground, but we do have, there are extensive burial grounds and areas that are in this region. And and I've actually, in the paper that I have coming out in January, I fleshed this out in more detail than anybody else ever has. I documented, well, I haven't documented. There was an Italian archaeology team that documented where all the major necropolises were with these kind of above ground turret tombs and stuff like that. They documented where all of those are, and there are 2 or 3 really extensive ones right in the Nehem territory. So yeah, you have all of these details where it's in the right place. It's in the general region where the frankincense trail turns eastward, which Book of Mormon scholars were already identifying as, hey, that's where we should find Nahom. It's in this area where you have extensive burial grounds and things like that. And we have the archaeological attestation of the name going back to Lehi's time. And that's where you kind of get this idea that all these different details are coming together and they're converging. And then, and then you even have, like, there are some stela, some funerary stones that have been found in the region, right? And I published a paper on this in Interpreter. There is a funerary stela that dates to the 6th century BC that has the name Ishmael on it, right?
Yeah, I remember reading about that in your article.
And I've tried to always be very careful when I talk about that. I don't claim to know.
Is it the Ishmael of the Book of Mormon? How would you know?
I don't claim that definitively at all. There's no way to know that. But I think I do think it's interesting. And if the Book of Mormon were any other text and its antiquity wasn't controversial, scholars would 100% be looking at that and being like, hey, it's we can't prove this, but it's relevant that we can find a burial stone with this name on it in the right time and place. And what I have tried to do in kind of exploring that possibility is I've looked at how common the name Ishmael is in South Arabia at the time.
That was going to be my question, because I remember, I think it was when I was talking to Dan Vogel and he said Ishmael was, I don't know if he meant in Saudi Arabia or in Israel, but it's one of the most common names. Yeah, so based on what we have archaeologically right now and the data that's available, or at least the data I've been able to find, and there's like 1,500 inscriptions from South Arabia, and about 7,000 to 8,000 have been digitized, and I have access to databases that I can search. So searching about half of the known inscriptions, it's actually a really rare name in the early 1st millennium BC. I can't pin everything down to 600 BC and say how popular it is, but there are only, I think, 4 attestations of that name in South Arabia between 1000 BC and 400 BC about.
On the other hand, you go up to Judah, you go up to Israel and Jerusalem, where Ishmael's supposed to be from, and it's a very common name up there. Between the 8th and 6th century BC, Ishmael was one of the most common names in Judah. And I thought that was kind of interesting in light of the biblical narrative, because like Isaac isn't attested at all as a name, but Ishmael is. And so why do the Israelites use the name Ishmael so much? But
that's a good point.
the archaeology, it's counterintuitive. And if you were making up a story about Israelites, right, leaving Jerusalem, it would be counterintuitive, I think, to name one of your characters Ishmael. Not impossible to know. There are Israelites named Ishmael mentioned in the Bible, so it's not like totally unknowable, but I think it would be kind of counterintuitive to your general intuitions. It's a really popular name in Judah, though, at the time. It's not very common down in South Arabia. And the style of funerary stela that this is, it's a South Arabian style. So there's nothing that would suggest or indicate like this specific person is a foreigner. But scholars talking about these stela have suggested that they were foreigners or people involved in the caravan trade who traveled widely. Some of the onomastics or the names on these stela suggest to scholars that they're actually people from the north who have come southward. In fact, there's one that is clearly a Babylonian name, and so they think it's a Babylonian woman that was buried there. Even though the stela itself is perfectly culturally South Arabian, the woman appears to be of Babylonian origin. And so the idea that this could have been a stela representing a foreigner who was traveling from the north, like Ishmael in the Book of Mormon is, like, it actually makes some sense. And these are like crude, low quality stela. Scholars think that they are, probably represent lower class people and things like that. And so if you were Lehi and his family traveling and you don't have a lot of resources, but you wanted to provide a burial marker for Ishmael, right? This is the kind of like cheap, quick thing you could have potentially been able to afford or something like that, right? So again, caveat, I don't know that it's the Ishmael in the Book of Mormon. I've never claimed it is the Ishmael in the Book of Mormon. But I do find it kind of interesting. In fact, before I ever found that, I had an argument with someone where I was pointing out all the other convergent stuff that we were talking about earlier. And their response to all of that was like, oh yeah, well, was someone named Ishmael buried there? And I was a little beside myself, because I was like, well, how would I even prove that? And if I could, how would you ever prove that it was the Ishmael from the Book of Mormon? Because I'm sure, even then I thought, I'm sure it's a common name. Other people would be named that. And that's still my position today. We can't ever prove it's the Ishmael from the Book of Mormon. It's certainly a known name. It could have been another person, obviously. But, it certainly doesn't hurt that there's someone named Ishmael who is buried in that area, around the right time period. So.
Okay, well, that's a good amount of information and explanation on Nahom, Bountiful. That's brilliant. And I think one last point on it is, I believe Nahom in Hebrew means to mourn or console. And would you view it as this is sort of the author doing sort of like a pun in the name, calling it Nahom? Because I believe it talks about the daughters of Ishmael mourning over the death of their father. Is that how you would interpret that?
Yeah, in fact, I think that there's so there's several layers to that. And I know some people have pushed back because like the South Arabian name doesn't mean comfort. But we have examples, and I've talked about this in some of my publications, of biblical authors doing bilingual wordplays where they're using their Hebrew words, but they're punning off of the meaning of those of similar sounding words in Egyptian or in another Semitic language. And there's these bilingual word plays that happen within the biblical text. So Hebrew writers like Nephi, who had bilingual knowledge, who knew multiple languages, were capable of making associations. And it's the same way like we do in English. You might hear jokes about like using the French oui, right? Which means yes, but it sounds like the English we, right? And so you might make jokes about that, or you might make jokes about, the German nine, which means no, but it sounds like our number 9, right? And there's jokes that'll play off of these dual language meanings and stuff like that. So I don't really think it matters that the South Arabian word does not mean comfort or mourning or whatever. Of very similar sounding words in Nephi's language, though, had associations with comfort, and consolation over losing a loved one, specifically over like the death of a loved one. It can be translated as mourn in some contexts. And I think there's actually multiple things going on. We don't need to go into it because I know I've already taken more time than you wanted me to on all of this stuff. But there's actually, I think there's kind of 3 stages to the wordplay, because the daughters of Ishmael mourn and they complain about like being hungry. And all of those associations are relevant to Semitic meanings of the NHM root. There's 2 different Semitic roots for NHM, and both of them have relevant meanings that play there. And then the brothers, like Laman and Lemuel and the sons of Ishmael, they plot to kill Nephi here. And Lehi, and plotting to murder is actually associated with the Hebrew Nahom, as a way, like, and its association is that like people seek to comfort themselves and comfort and reconcile themselves through the act of killing someone who's made them angry or whatever, right? That's kind of the meaning. And so this plotting to murder, Alan Goff actually talked about this in a Farms publication a number of years ago. But this idea that they're plotting to murder at Nahom, that kind of seems to be echoing off of the resonance of that meaning as well. And then the way they, at the end, they reconcile themselves and repent, right? Repentance and having a change of heart, specifically around whether or not you're going to kill or not. That is reflected, that's associated with the Hebrew meaning for Nahom. And so you have like these multiple stages of wordplay going on. And then another one, people haven't talked about this, but another one that I actually find interesting, if you do want to be a stickler about it being a South Arabian name, in South Arabian, the word for to mourn is Noah. I don't know if that's how they would pronounce it, but it's NWH. It's the same root that is translated as Noah in the Bible.
Right.
And means to rest in Hebrew. But the thing is, in the Hebrew Bible, Noah, the name Noah, is punned off of the word Nahom all the time. So even from a South Arabian perspective, a name with NHM could be punned off of the South Arabian root for to mourn, which is the same as the word Noah, right, in Hebrew. So there's a lot of potential little word plays in there that I think are really relevant as well. Absolutely.
That's really interesting. So I know, like, sometimes critics, they can scoff at old world geography. Nahom is just NHM on an altar. In my mind, I think it's how well it all fits and converges, in the right location, the altars dating to the right time. I think particularly the travel eastward towards Bountiful, the strong candidates there, like, it seems to be very, very consistent, and it all converges well together. And something that I thought about, as we were going through this is, maybe it's not like complete proof, right? But then it's also like, what realistically would we expect to find if it were an ancient historical travel, and it is an ancient record? What realistically would we expect to find archaeologically that's stronger than this, other than maybe a carving like Lehi was here, Nephi was here? Like, realistically, would we expect to find much more if this was an ancient travel? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Oh, 100%. I think this is as compelling as archaeological evidence for a written historical source can possibly get. Again, short of having like an inscription that's explicitly and undoubtedly like, Nephi, son of Lehi from Jerusalem, was here and buried his father-in-law Ishmael. Like, short of having like an inscription that explicit, right? This is the kind of evidence archaeologists and biblical scholars, or scholars of other textual written records, historians and things like that, this is the kind of evidence they're dealing with all the time when they're trying to piece things together. And one of the things I've done that I don't think a lot of people have a lot of background in to really appreciate this is they haven't actually read or studied very many other like ancient travel accounts and things like that, and look to see like, how well can we reconstruct the route that was followed for those accounts, and how well do we, what can we do to document those specific journeys and things like that. And this is right on par, and in fact, in some cases stronger than the evidence we can find for any other ancient travel accounts. There's one, it's kind of interesting, is in the Greek historian, or is it, he might be a Latin historian, I can't remember off the top of my head. I think he's Greek though, Strabo. He's from the 1st century BC, and he tells the story about the Roman army marching down the coast of Arabia, basically following roughly the same route that Lehi would have. He gives us almost no toponyms during that journey, so we can't really reconstruct exactly what route they're taking, but we know where they end up because he does give us details, and we know they end up in that same Wadi Jaf area, and then they go to war with Saba, and they fail, they run out of resources, and they have to flee back. And this is a whole army, 10,000 soldiers. They march through this exact same area that Lehi does. It's like 600 years more recent than Lehi's journey. And there's virtually no archaeological evidence that this ever happened, right? We just have this one account. We can't document the route they're following. There is one possible Roman inscription that might be, oddly enough, it's a burial inscription. So in the exact same area, in that Wadi Jaf area, there's a burial inscription in Roman or in Latin that they think was one of the Roman soldiers, and it dates to about that time. And that's it. That's the only evidence they have for this journey involving 10,000 soldiers, right? And I thought it was actually kind of striking that it's basically the same kind of evidence we have. Inscriptions where someone was buried is basically the only evidence we have for both of these journeys, covering roughly the same territory. So yeah, this is pretty normal. And like I said, look, if the text of First Nephi had been found untranslated in an archaeological context and scholars translated it, this would be exactly how they pieced together the route of Lehi. And there would be absolutely no doubt in anyone's mind that Nahom was this Nahom area. I mean,
so you think it's because of the implications, because then this would support not just like Nahom being a historical place, but then, you know, First Nephi and then the origin of the Book of Mormon and Joseph Smith receiving it.
Yeah, it's these presuppositions, it's these religious implications that are tied to it that make people go, whoa, like it just can't be, right? It just can't be. And you know, like I talked about, part of what makes it really compelling to me is even if we did not have these inscriptions, this is the area where we would be saying Nahom has to be, just based on the geographic details of the text. Mm-hmm. And that was established, like I said, more or less established by scholars interpreting the text before we knew about Nahom and the inscriptions. And so for me, that's a big part of what makes it compelling. Is it's when people say it's right where it's supposed to be, that's what they're talking about, is where the evidence was already pointing we should find a place called Nahom. That's basically where we actually found it.
That's interesting, because whenever I went through a faith crisis and I left the church for a little while, and whenever I was ex-Mormon, I remember I knew about Nahom, but I didn't take it very seriously. But I remember I watched a presentation, I think it might have been LDS Truth Claims was the YouTube channel, and they went through the old world geography and how everything just converged very well together. You know, Shazer, yeah, the breaking of the bow, Nahom, going to Bountiful. And I remember at the time, I sort of intellectually knew that like this actually converges quite well. And I remember thinking at the time, like, Joe Smith must have had a map. That's what I went to, like, that he must have had some sort of map, because in my mind, it sort of converged too well for this to just be coincident, for him to have just happened to get this to correlate so well with Arabian geography. And could you answer that? Is there any evidence of Joseph perhaps having access to a map with Nahom on it and seeing, you know, this Bountiful area?
Yeah, I mean, that's basically what people have resorted to, and there are others who have basically, some people who have basically they've conceded the overall argument here that, yeah, there's a really compelling convergence, and therefore Joseph Smith must have had a map, right? And because there are some maps that predate 1829 that have Nahom on it, right, they conclude from that, therefore Joseph Smith could have had access to it, and that settles it, right? And it doesn't matter to them, to some people, that you can't actually put any of those maps. I mean, there was, I think it was the old website Mormon Think, they had this thing on there where they claimed that there was a map at Allegheny College, and that was really close to Harmony, Pennsylvania, where Joseph Smith was translating. So this would have been accessible to him. Well, they identified the wrong Harmony, Pennsylvania. The Harmony, Pennsylvania, where Allegheny College is close to, is like 300 miles across the state of Pennsylvania from the Harmony where Joseph Smith is translating. And that's the closest I've seen anyone actually try to put one of these maps in Joseph Smith's vicinity. And so, and I mean, the maps argument runs into a lot of other problems for me. It really, like, it can hypothetically account for the name and its approximate location, but you wouldn't know anything about the Frankincense Trail and the eastward turn from any of those maps. You wouldn't know about a fertile place like the Dhofar region that fits all the description of Bountiful on those maps. And I do maybe note here really quickly, like, yes, people had an idea of Arabia Felix in 19th century, but that was the southwest corner of Arabia. And so when Joseph Smith dictates the text and says they went nearly eastward after they finally reached southern Arabia, he's literally leading them out of the Arabia Felix area. And if you actually look on these Nahom maps and you actually draw a line eastward from where they put Nahom, it leads like literally right to the words that say barren desert on those maps. So if Joseph Smith is using these maps and he's being like, okay, I'll have them turn eastward from here, and where does that lead me? He's not going to come up with Bountiful as their destination.
I think in Joe Smith's day, people would have scoffed and made fun of Bountiful, like this lush oasis on the coast of Arabia. That's something that wasn't known.
Yeah, I mean, there are people who do that. You know, we've got 19th century sources of people being like, this is absurd. We've even got, like, as recently as the 1980s, people saying, you know, funny quibs like, if the only thing Arabia is bountiful in is petroleum and sunshine or whatever, right? And so yeah, we've got people who saw that and they thought it was absurd. And what critics have done is they've tried to point out, like, there were sources that talked about this fertile part of Arabia called Arabia Felix. But like I said, that was the southwest corner of Arabia. That was literally the area they were turning and leaving from, according to the Book of Mormon narrative. And so the idea that Joseph Smith could have put this together from these maps, he's directly contradicting what he could have learned from these maps. And other contemporary sources about Arabia when he has them make that eastward turn. There's also, you know, there's the improbability that, you know, there's tons of names on these maps. Like, what's the probability he picks Nahom? And what's the probability that one of the names he picks, the name he picks at random, happens to be one we can archaeologically trace back to Lehi's time? I mean, there are other names on there. There's the city of Marib is on these maps, right? And so there are other names on there that trace back to pre-Islamic times. But how many of the names on there that he could have randomly picked out would have had the dumb luck of, we're going to find the archaeological evidence to show it goes back to Lehi's time? And, you know, there's just lots of questions like that. Why didn't he include more names throughout the journey? You know, if that's what he's doing.
And if he did copy it, why didn't he copy it the way it was spelt in the map? Why did he change the vowels? Would he have known that there wouldn't have been no vowels in the Semitic script?
Yeah, I mean, look, the he got it from a map explanation. For me, it just doesn't cut it. And if I ever were to stop believing in the Book of Mormon, I still would not believe in the map theory. I would basically see this as just one incredibly extraordinary coincidence.
Yeah.
Like, to me, that's the only other explanation. In fact, I don't know if you ever saw the series that Kyler Rasmussen did on the Interpreter website called Estimating the Evidence, I think is what he called it. And he was doing like Bayesian statistics to try and judge the probability of different evidential claims, both pro and con. And he looked at Nahom, and I think he's doing it pretty generally. I think you could actually refine some of the statistics in here and get a more accurate number. But for his purposes, you know, he just made some general assumptions about the probability of different steps. But he tried to determine the probability of Joseph Smith actually seeing one of those maps and getting the information from the map, or Joseph just finding this by, you know, like, just by coincidence, throwing this out there and it all adding up. And he basically concluded that it's actually more probable, though highly improbable, it's more probable that it's just one extraordinary coincidence than that he actually saw one of those maps. And so, and I agree, that's kind of where I come down on that. And so, you know, nothing's impossible.
Agree,
Nothing's ever impossible. But it seems a lot more likely that this is either coming from someone who actually knew and lived and traveled through Arabia and is providing their eyewitness experience, or it's just some incredibly extraordinary coincidence, right? Like, that's, to me, those are the intellectually honest options as far as I'm concerned.
No, I think it converges together really well. And certainly you can't argue that First Nephi is inconsistent with Old World Jerusalem and Arabian geography. Okay, so we'll move away from that. That was a really good discussion. Maybe these ones we'll talk over, maybe not as much as in depth. Any thoughts on ancient names in the Book of Mormon? I remember I read through an article about the name Mulek. So he's identified as one of the sons of Zedekiah who flees over to the Americas. The Nephites later meet with the Mulekites, and I believe Malchiah in the Old Testament is identified as one of the sons of Zedekiah. And was it in the 1980s they found like a stamp seal in Paleo-Hebrew of, how do you pronounce it, Malchiahu?
Malchiahu, yeah.
And that Mulek is sort of a shortened Hebrew sort of like nickname or variant of that name, which I thought was, it's kind of interesting. Like, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, what I think is actually really interesting about that, and I think you summarized that accurately enough. The Bible doesn't explicitly identify Malchiah or Malchiyahu as a son of Zedekiah, but they call him a son of the king. And the
Oh, okay.
context suggests that the timing, the king at the time is Zedekiah. So it
Right.
seems plausible that he's the son of the king. The King James translation doesn't translate it that way, though. It translates Hamalak, which is the king. It translates that as, well, Hamelech as a personal name. And so you wouldn't have known, Joseph Smith wouldn't have known this, like reading his Bible. And what I kind of think is interesting about it, when you ask yourself, what kind of evidence might we expect to find? Lehi, could we expect to find explicit evidence of the man Lehi himself? Well, I mean, maybe, but I mean, hundreds of thousands of millions of people have lived and died throughout like the ancient Middle East or whatever, and we don't have any documentation of who they were and what their names were and stuff like that. So the probability of just like finding a random person, even a wealthy citizen like Lehi, I mean, it's a needle in a haystack, right? But the prince, right, the son of the king, we should maybe be able to find evidence for that person, and sure enough, we do, right? And it's worth noting, people who want to dismiss this, I don't think, always, you can always dismiss it somehow, right? You can, the vowels of Mulek aren't right or whatever, right? But what I've always thought was interesting about this is David Noel Friedman, who is not a Latter-day Saint. He's one of the most prominent biblical scholars of the late 20th century and early 21st century before he passed away. He was friends with several Latter-day Saints who pointed this stuff out to him and asked him, like, hey, what do you think of Book of Mormon having like Mulek as the son of King Zedekiah, and then we have this in Jeremiah, and we have the stamp seal. And he was like, well, if Joseph Smith was just making this up, that was a pretty good guess. Like he was really impressed with it. So, that really is, I think, a pretty striking sort of thing. There's a lot of other names, evidence. I actually did a paper on the name Sariah. It's in the Bible spelled Sariah. It's spelled differently than the Book of Mormon spells it, but there's some scholars who have actually argued Sariah might be the more accurate way to translate that name. But in the Bible, it's only a male's name. It's only used for men. But then in the Elephantine documents, these are documents of a Jewish colony that left Jerusalem around the 7th century BC and established a colony there. And then we found their documents from like the 5th century BC. There are 2 women named Sariah, or Saraya, however you want to translate it. There are 2 women with that name in the Elephantine documents. And so we have, definitive evidence this is a Hebrew woman's name from about the time of the Book of Mormon. The name Lehi is, I think, underappreciated because it's only a place name in the Bible. And as a place name, it doesn't make a lot of sense as a personal name because it's being played off of the name, the word for jaw or cheek, right, which is Lehi. And that's not really a very common name to use as a personal name in Semitic languages to name people after body parts and things like that. But we have found there are tons of attestations of the name Lehi or Lahai, however you want to spell it, right? There are tons of attestations of it in various Semitic languages, in South Arabian languages, in North Arabian languages, in other Northwest Semitic languages like Aramaic and Phoenician, and really old languages like Amorite and which, I mean, that I don't know if that means much to you, but like in the earliest strata of Northwest Semitic languages, which is the parent language of Hebrew and stuff, we have attestations of this name Lehi or Lahai. And so it's a very good, compelling Semitic name. The names, Nephi, I think, is really compelling as an Egyptian name, and then we even have the wordplay on it.
Bearing
Nephi
goods.
it is good, right? It likely means good in Egyptian. And really, like a lot of those things, Matt Bowen has done tons of these things where he's found, he's looked at what the likely etymology of Book of Mormon names are, and then he's identified ways that that's being punned or played off of. We already talked about with Nahom, which is all very interesting. But some of the, I mean, he's found it with Egyptian names, with Hebrew names, with like in the book of Enos on Jacob and Enos, he's found word plays there. The name Alma being young man or related etymologically to the Hebrew root for young man. And also, I think hiding and secrecy, it has these connections. And Shiloh, the place of Shiloh being a place where there's supposed to be peace, and that's where they have war instead. There's kind of this inverse. We already talked about the puns in the Bible on Noah.
Some of the names almost connecting with part of the story as well.
Yeah,
similar to
yeah.
what
I
you
mean,
might see in the Bible.
these names are, there's Matt Bowen has done so many of them. And again, sometimes I think people don't have the full context of how compelling this is, because most people who are reading this stuff as evidence for the Book of Mormon haven't gone and read biblical scholarship that talks about how the biblical authors did all these puns and word plays on names. And they haven't read that, and how biblical scholars analyze these and find them and determine if there's a wordplay there. Matt Bowen, this is what he did for his PhD dissertation, is he specialized on the onomastics in I can't remember which biblical book, but he specialized in the onomastics of and word plays in a biblical book. And so this is a method he honed as part of his dissertation. And then he came and he said, look, I can find all this same stuff in the Book of Mormon. And there are even texts like the Apocalypse of Abraham, which we do not have in a Semitic original. We do not have it. We only have it in Slavonic, which is like this Eastern European language from like medieval times. The manuscripts we have for the Apocalypse of Abraham are from like the 14th through the 17th century. So it's really late, and it's only in Slavonic. But scholars are convinced, and there's like a consensus on this, that it was originally written in either Aramaic and Hebrew, and that it's from like the 1st or 2nd century AD. So that's like a 1400-year gap between when it was written and the earliest manuscript we have, and a major linguistic difference. And one of the main evidences they use for saying this was originally written in either Aramaic or Hebrew is the names, which appear to have Aramaic or Hebrew etymologies, and they function in the narrative with these word plays and allusions based on what those names mean in Semitic languages. And so this kind of
That's interesting.
wordplay that people like Matt Bowen have found, it's used by other scholars in other contexts as evidence that a text is a translation from a Semitic original. And this is also true, by the way, of things like Hebraisms that a lot of people kind of dismiss because of like the King James Version or whatever. But I do think there are some Hebraisms that can't really be explained that way. We don't need to go into them because that's not really my area anyway. But and there are like just lots of things, like we can actually point by point the evidence that convinces scholars that like things like the Apocalypse of Abraham are translations from the Semitic source. We have every single type of evidence there in the text of the Book of Mormon. So
That's really
I mean,
interesting. And there's even
I
weird names like Pahoran, I think Pakumenai, like
yeah,
weird words to like an average person. You think like this is really weird, like just weird made up names, and then it's like no, they are like authentic
yeah,
ancient Egyptian names. Like
yeah,
that's
and
pretty amazing.
those ones were identified as Egyptian names by William F. Albright, who was one of the greatest like scholars of the ancient Near East in the mid 20th century. And he was writing to an anti-Mormon who was hoping he would like dismiss the Book of Mormon. And he's like, I'm actually struck by the fact that there's these two Egyptian names in the Book of Mormon when it's identified as having originally been written in Reformed Egyptian. And there are word plays. I think Paanki, the name Paanki is identified as having wordplay on it by Matt Bowen, right? So if you think, oh, maybe Joseph Smith somehow learned the Hebrew and did all these word plays in Hebrew, well, what are you going to do about the Egyptian ones? Because there's no way Joseph Smith could have known anything about Egyptian in
And we know we
1829.
didn't learn Hebrew. I think it was until Kirtland
Yeah, I mean,
years
it's
later.
not till 1835 he's learning Hebrew, and you can make, maybe he read like Adam Clark's commentary or whatever, but it's like, well, how much Hebrew is he really going to know? Can that really explain all of the Hebrew word plays people have found here? I find that kind of evidence really compelling, and like I said, it's the kind of evidence that scholars use in mainstream academia to establish that a text is a translation from an ancient Semitic source.
Right.
So again, you can start to shrug your shoulders and say, hey, there's a lot of coincidences here, or yeah, you can't prove definitively that this etymology, because there's always potential differences in vowels or how you transliterate or translate the names and things like that. No, but I mean, those are problems with the Apocalypse of Abraham names too. You look at the names and how they're rendered in Slavonic, and you have to make some guesses about what it would have related to in the original Semitic. So these are not insurmountable problems in like academic methodologies, or they don't become a barrier to accepting, hey, when you have something plausible and it all comes together, that makes a compelling case. And we've got this with dozens of names in the Book of Mormon. In the Apocalypse of Abraham, I think they have it with 5 names in the Apocalypse of Abraham, and that was enough to convince scholars like, yeah, this is a translation. So again, I just think a lot of people, when they're reading about this stuff and they're trying to decide whether it's compelling or not, they don't have enough context for how scholars have done this kind of work in mainstream academia and how these arguments compare with that. So
That's really fascinating. Because if they see it in the Bible, then they would accept it that that's
Yeah,
a translation of other languages. But when you see it in the Book of Mormon, it might be dismissed.
yeah, exactly.
Right. So when we talk a little bit about maybe the New World, I'm guessing your view of where you think most likely this can be controversial, right? And the church doesn't have an official position where the Book of Mormon happened. I think most scholars, and I believe you would lean towards Mesoamerica being probably the best fit, the best model, probably going off, John Sorensen's model. Brent Gardner's done a lot of work. It's probably in terms of looking at both civilizations, looking at the geography, the consistency of it, things with geology, it seems to match and correlate quite well. I did an interview with Brent Gardner on things which converge between Mesoamerica or Mayan culture in the Book of Mormon. And instead of looking for like definitive archaeological evidence or finding the Book of Mormon in Mesoamerica, I think Brandt's approach, maybe people like John Sorensen, is can we find Mesoamerica things in the context or the culture in the Book of Mormon? Are there civilizations there at the right time? I remember like learning about like the warfare in the Book of Mormon, Mayan culture, or like them having like costly apparel or civilizations being there at the right time in certain places. Polygamy, kings among the Nephites, correlating with kings among the Mayans. Not like proving anything, but it was like, okay, there's some things which seem to correlate, and this seems somewhat plausible. And then I found the geology as well. I didn't don't know if you've seen an episode with Jerry Grover on geology and the Book of Mormon. He's obviously a geologist, that's his expertise. And just all and I read this morning actually Third Nephi 8 in my own personal reading. And I was reading about like all the destruction in Third Nephi, like the storms and thick ash and sharp lightnings and not being able to light a torch. And later there's going to be sunken cities and things, and how that correlates really well with known volcanic activity, earthquake and volcanic eruption. That I think San Martin is the volcano Jerry Grover believes is like the best candidate, and it's in sort of like the right area, and there would have been an eruption dated to that century, and how it correlates really well with the Mesoamerican geography. I just find that all really cool.
Yeah, it is, and you've already talked to Brent Gardner, you've already talked to Jerry Grover. These are guys who can dive into all of that a lot better than I can. But I do find I think we take for granted sometimes some of these big picture sorts of things. If you're going to make up a story about anything, right, and you're just going to provide on the fly as you're dictating this text, you're going to provide all these narratives that have geographic details and stuff like that. Number one, it's going to be really hard to keep all of those geographic details straight, right? That's a complex sort of process. But number two, it's really hard to have all of those geographic details come together and converge and fit in a real world location in a compelling way, unless you really knew a lot about that real world location, its geography in the first place. And, I know there are people who will make quibbles or disagreements about different aspects of it, or the directional, axis of Mesoamerica. Some people really didn't like Sorensen's geography because of some of the directional issues and whatnot. But I found that overall correlation really compelling when I looked into it a number of years ago, and I've looked into some of the other Mesoamerican models as well. And there are maybe a few things I would tweak or adapt from Sorensen's model based on some of the other people like Garth Norman and Joe Allen and Rick Hauk and Kirk Magleby, who I work with here at Scripture Central. They've got some interesting stuff too, but overall, I do feel like the Sorensen model holds up really well. The directional issues don't bother me a lot. Directions are often culturally adaptable, and they're often if I give directions somewhere, I'm going to be pretty generic a lot of the times, right? I'm not going to be like, you go exactly southeast for this long. I mean, Nephi was really specific with his directions, but eastward, northward, right? We get these kind of generic things going on. And you also have the fact that sometimes names become fossilized in a language, so that a region becomes known as like the East, or a region, or the East Sea, because it was named by people for whom it was east of them at the time. But then that name becomes a part of the standard nomenclature that you use for places. And so you might talk about the East, even though it's north of where you're at. I mean, if I talk about North Carolina, that's not actually north of where I'm at in Utah. That's east of where I'm at in Utah, but it's called North Carolina. That's what it's called, right? So
Right.
So the directional issue, and that's not a detailed argument to justify Sorensen's directional stuff, but on the whole, it just doesn't bother me. I'm really struck by that overall convergence and correlation there, because it involves literally hundreds upon hundreds of details, and the likelihood that a person could just make this book up and have it end up pretty accurately describing a real geographical region. I mean, yes, you've got to make some interpretive licenses and stuff like that, but I mean, that's really impressive. That's really hard to do. And then, yeah, you mentioned like the civilizations and the patterns of civilization, I think are really interesting, because you have like the rise and fall of the Olmec society, and then the rise and fall of the Maya.
Yeah.
And just the chronological trajectory of those things fits pretty roughly with the rise and fall of the Jaredites and the Nephites. And that's not to suggest that they are the same people, but
Sort of like they're among them or participated in their culture, civilizations.
Yeah, I mean, you could probably do the same thing with like Latter-day Saints and America, right? Like the rise and fall of specifically Latter-day Saints living in North America, and the trajectory of our church and culture is going to follow a similar pattern to that of the United States of America, right? It's going to have the similar trajectory. And so because we participate in and we're subject to, like, if the United States collapsed, a lot of Latter-day Saints would be impacted by that, and that would be reflected in Latter-day Saint history, right? So
Right.
so I think you have the fact that like the rises and collapse of civilization and the ebbs and flows of populations and stuff like that, it all correlates really well with what you see in the Book of Mormon. And again, that's really striking. It's hard to imagine someone just making this up, and you're just making things up about when this all happens, and when population booms and when population shrinks and when wars happen and stuff like that, and to have it broadly correlate and stuff like that, that's really impressive for me. I mean, I don't know what I could say that maybe Brant Gardner hasn't already talked about, or Jerry Grover. Some of the things I do find really compelling, though. I actually find the setting of the land of Nephi in particular, and the Mesoamerican context there for some of those stories really, really compelling. The way that, Nephi
It's
says
sort of
he's
situated in more northern Guatemala, isn't it?
yeah, well, southern
Highland Guatemala.
Guatemala, but
Highland Guatemala, that's what I meant.
in the highlands of Guatemala. And every time you talk about going to the land of Nephi in the text, they're going up into this highland area, and it explains
They're going down to Zarahemla.
Yeah, and it explains some of the things that you might not notice or understand. Nephi, when he starts quoting from Isaiah, the very first text he quotes from in 2nd Nephi after he's established his city is Isaiah 2, where it talks about building a temple, the house of the Lord, in the tops of the mountains, right? And so Nephi's gone up to these highlands and he's built a temple. And then it says that all nations would flow unto it. And, in the latter days, we've interpreted that as, oh, that's the Salt Lake temple, right? But
yeah.
And in the old world, they would have actually interpreted it as the Jerusalem temple in the highlands there. But Nephi seems to be, he built his temple, and, people talk about, does he mention others or whatever, right? But Nephi's built this temple, and now he's quoting about Isaiah about the building of a temple in the tops of the mountains and all nations flowing unto it. And there's other references throughout that block of Isaiah to other nations or Gentiles becoming a part of Israel. It seems like what he's doing is he's trying to formulate a people around this temple that has incorporated some indigenous peoples, and he's giving them a way to, like, hey, we've now got this temple, and if we all congregate here and we worship through this temple, we can become one people, one nation, right? And even though you may not be part of our Israelite heritage, you can flow to this temple. All nations can flow to it and make the covenants with the Lord and become part of our people, right? And so that kind of seems like you can start to explain some stuff that's going on here. And then, like, I know Brant Gardner, he probably talked about this, the fact that, like, the people want Nephi to become a king, and the institution of kingship is just emerging in Mesoamerica at that time period. There's obviously, it's a time period, not specifically like right at 600 BC, but we see it happening in other cities right there in the highland areas as well, like where this political sophistication starts to emerge, like in the 7th or 6th century BC or thereabouts. And so you can see it's kind of the same thing that happens in the Bible when they go to when they go to the prophet Nathan and they say, we want a king. Why? Because all the nations around us have kings. So the Nephites are like, whoa, all the nations around us are starting to develop a king. We need a king, and we want Nephi to be that king. So these sorts of things start to make sense. The story about Abinadi I find really, really compelling in this setting as well, because you fast forward to that, and one of the things I always thought was weird is the priests of Noah asking Abinadi to interpret this passage from Isaiah 52 about, how beautiful upon the mounts are them that, that bring the message of glad tidings, their feet upon the mountain, blah, 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 blah. And, the common, if you go to Sunday school or whatever, the way you'll commonly have that interpreted is people are like, oh, the priests are just stupid and they're going to kill, they're putting Abinadi on trial, but they are, they're trying to ask him how to understand the Bible before they kill him. That's so stupid. No. This is a legal trial, and this is their legal defense for what they're doing, is they're appealing to Isaiah 52, and they're saying, look, we, after our people abandoned the land of Nephi and went down to the lowlands in the Sidon River Valley, we came back up to the tops of the mountains. We reestablished our presence here in this prophetic place that's supposed to be our land of inheritance. And we are the ones who are preaching glad tidings in the tops of the mountains and all of that. We're the ones fulfilling this. So how can you accuse us of being wicked and apostate and bring this message of doom and gloom? And so they're kind of using that as a proof text to defend themselves.
I've never thought or heard of that before. That's really interesting.
Yeah, this is actually, you can, if you read my paper in the Koford volume that I talked about, that I published on apologetics, I talked about this in that one, and it's not original to me. It's actually if you haven't read it, one of the most compelling books is Legal Cases of the Book of Mormon by John W. Welch. It doesn't sound like it's going to be super compelling or interesting, but he shows that he does some really interesting analysis of all these instances of legal trials in the Book of Mormon.
Mm-hmm.
And he shows how they are consistent with what you'd expect from ancient Israelite law.
Right. So like prophetic lawsuit sort of things.
Yeah, so that kind of stuff. But in order to do it, he provides these really interesting analyses of the narrative context for all this stuff. And so he's the one who really first put that out there. But Joe Spencer's also talked about it in some of his stuff. But it's really compelling to me the way that all comes together. And then like Lehi's prophecy, or not Lehi, Abinadi's prophecy of what would happen to them if they didn't repent, where he says, let's see, what exactly is it? He warns the people that they'll be smitten with hail and an east wind and insects that will come and devour their grain and all of that stuff. And John Sorensen, this is a little detail from John Sorensen that was overlooked, and I actually did some research to flesh it out a little bit for a Know Why we did at Book of Mormon Central. And Kerry Hull, I don't know if you've heard of him. He's a BYU professor who specializes in Mesoamerican stuff. He really fleshed out the stuff on the east wind a lot. But basically, in this specific geographic region where Sorensen thinks the land of Nephi is, a wind from the northeast would have brought in locusts that usually settle in the valley, the Montague River Valley. I think that's the one that's northeast of that of the valley of Valley of Guatemala, where he thinks the land of Nephi is. An east wind would have brought those insects in, and they would have devoured the crops, and it would have also brought in storm systems that usually pass by, and it would have clashed with the warm heat that's coming up from the coast, and it would have created, and it's been historically documented that when this happens, it creates hailstorms in this area and stuff like that. And so this whole combination of a specific phenomenon, east wind, insects that will devour your crops, and hail, it fits this geographic setting really, really well, really, really nicely. We even have a Mayan text that it's like a Mayan prayer that is like praying specifically that those three catastrophes will not befall them, because they're usually, they're caused by meteorological phenomenon that will cause all three at once. So you've got a Mayan prayer that is specifically praying, please don't have these three things happen to us.
Wow.
Yeah. And then, I mean, there's so much specifically with the land of Nephi, I feel like, that fits so well. There's also, I don't know if Jerry Grover would have talked about this with you, or maybe Brent Gardner, I don't know, but there's the sunken city, the underwater city, the underwater ruins.
Yeah, Jerry talked about it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. that's really what's really compelling to me about that is before those ruins were discovered, John Sorensen was like, yeah, this is probably where the city of Jerusalem was, and we should maybe expect to find some ruins underwater there, right? And lo and behold, like that's basically a prediction being made based on the Book of Mormon text that was fulfilled. Like we predicted there'd be something archaeologically under those waters, and it turns out there was something there. And that's, like I said, I just find that's really striking, really compelling to me, that a model for where the Book of Mormon took place could basically predict where we would find specific archaeological ruins, right?
Yeah, I remember Jerry as well showed that certain cities that were destroyed or sunken in the Book of Mormon, he showed geologically, according to Sorensen's map, how that would have happened as well, and how that matches with where Sorensen has certain cities. And I felt like that was almost like another sort of testament, or it was another discipline like further supporting as well. I just thought that was pretty amazing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And in fact, reading Jerry Grover's book, when I first read that was one of the things that really kind of sealed the deal for me on Sorensen's model being more persuasive than some of the other ones out there.
Yeah,
because he showed how almost everything, I mean, he makes some tweaks and modifications, but he really did show how like the most plausible geological scenario for the destruction there really fits compellingly with Sorensen's model. And again, that's basically predictive, because Sorensen didn't have all that data. He wouldn't have known that.
yeah.
But Jerry Grover comes around later and says, actually, all of these places fit really well with the exact kind of destruction you'd expect to find if you had this volcanic eruption on a strike slip fault like you do with the San Martin volcano in Veracruz. Maybe one last thing. I know we're taking kind of a long time on this, and Mesoamerica
there's so much to discuss. I think whenever I messaged you, I think I said maybe we'll do it in like 45 minutes to an hour. That was that was stupid of me.
Well, I'm sorry. I've talked your ear off on this, but
it's okay. I have a lot of long interview. I enjoy the long episodes. I usually feel bad though for my guests if they're giving up time, and I'm like, oh,
I know there's a big time difference between you and I, and it's a lot later in the day for you, so you're probably tired. But one of the things that I think has been like overlooked a lot, doesn't get talked about a lot, that I find really interesting, is this paper by a guy named Jim Hawker, excuse me, that came out in Interpreter in 2018, where it talks about the famine in Helaman 11, which would date to around like 20 BC or 25 BC. And there's actually evidence specifically from like the dendrochronology, which is tree rings, and then also like stalactites and stalagmites in Mesoamerica, that actually show there was a massive drought right around that time period. We can't pin it down to an exact year of when it happened, and that drought lasted approximately at least 3 years, and the Book of Mormon chronology, it lasts 3 to 3.5 years is how long that famine lasts. So
I think I included that in one. I think I did an episode on archaeological evidence, and I think I included that in my sort of section on like Mesoamerican convergences. I thought that was quite cool and interesting as well. It doesn't get talked about a whole lot.
No, it doesn't. But it's to me, it's up there with some of that geological volcanic sort of stuff that Jerry Grover does. Because for one thing, it's more scientific, so people will put a lot of more stock in this kind of scientific stuff. But again, that is something that's extraordinarily hard to fake. If you're just making it up, right, and you're going to make up a story about a famine happening and at a particular time, and you're going to give enough information that we can date its time period and we can date how long it took, like that is an extraordinary that's an extraordinary prediction to make, right? That could happen, and that we can now come with the science and test it and say, yeah, there was in fact a drought that happened at about that time, and it lasted about that long. Like that is phenomenal. That it makes it plausible. Yeah. I find that kind of stuff sometimes in some ways even more compelling than the historical cultural sort of stuff that I do more of, because that's more my area of expertise, but or my area of research and stuff. But yeah, lots and lots of stuff with Mesoamerica that really I don't see how geographically, I don't see how it could be anywhere else. other people will disagree, but I just don't think if you're going to follow,
I kind of feel the same way, if I'm being honest, because before I dive deeply into the Mesoamerican model, I still acknowledge that I thought the old world geography correlated very well, but I wasn't too sure of Heartland model. I was almost struggling to believe in a historical Book of Mormon, and it was the Mesoamerican diving into that, looking at the scholarship, where I was like, this looks plausible. If it happened anywhere, probably this is the only plausible location to me.
Yeah, no, yeah. I just don't see geographically how the details could fit anywhere else. But then when you do, when you accept it as a hypothesis and then start working out the historical details and seeing how it fits, like it really is striking how it all comes together. You know, we still don't have, you know, I'd love it if we could have inscriptions that tell us exactly where Zarahemla was and
Yeah.
identify a king named Benjamin
Mormon
or
was
whatever,
here.
right? Like that would be extraordinary. And I'll be the first to jump for joy or whatever if we ever found evidence like that. But I feel like based on the kind of data that we currently have, and you know, part of the issue is there aren't really a lot of readable inscriptions that date to Book of Mormon times. Scholars know that there's written language in Mesoamerica going all the way back to Olmec times, but there are a few inscriptions they can't interpret that are that old. But you know, we really don't start getting interpretable writing from the Maya world until about 400 AD, which is about the end of the Book of Mormon, right? I think there's a couple. There's like one from like maybe around 250 or something like that. And there's one a little earlier from San Bartolo that's got a few glyphs that they can interpret. But like, it really is like, we have so little written source material. Like you can't expect this kind of like evidence for Book of Mormon names and places explicitly mentioned in texts when none of our texts even go back to Book of Mormon times, right? But given the kind of data we have available, the Book of Mormon correlates about as well as you could possibly expect it to, in my opinion. And again, does that leave room for doubt? I mean, sure, you can find ways to dismiss it, but like in my opinion, like the Book of Mormon just has no business being that correlating as well as it does if it's not true, you know.
Yeah, if it's a 19th century text that Drew Smith made up, it's amazing how well some of these things correlate, like with the old world geography, things with Mesoamerica, Mayan culture. I find the geology almost is like amazing how well it converged, like, you know, similar to old world geography. Like it would be, there's just one heck of a coincidence if Joseph just made it all up. Now maybe we could finish on the witnesses of the gold plates, and then we'll probably leave it there for part one. You know, the witnesses, you have the three witnesses, you have David Whitmer, Martin Harris, Oliver Cowdery, who claim to have a vision of, you know, seeing the angel, seeing the plates. You have the 8 witnesses who claim to see and handle the plates, to see the fine engravings thereon. You also have some unofficial witnesses, people like Mary Whitmer, who claim to have sort of a vision, seeing the angel in the plates. Other people like Josiah Stoll or Emma, some of his family members who held the plates but covered in a cloth. So there's a lot of testimony, both sort of supernatural, visionary, and natural, supporting the authenticity of the gold plates, which is another sort of, it adds to, it corroborates that there was gold plates.
Yeah, so I remember, like, as a kid growing up, I was always like most impressed with the 3 witnesses because they see an angel, and that's incredible. And
they hear the voice of God.
And they hear the voice of God, which
cool.
we don't talk about that component to it often enough, but they have this really miraculous visionary experience. And so that was always what was most interesting to me. And I can even remember, like, as a kid growing up thinking like, well, the 8 witnesses aren't that impressive. Like Joseph could have just showed him like something that was like fake plates or something. And I mean, as a kid, I wasn't thinking through like, well, how would he actually make fake plates or whatever? But but I thought the 8 witnesses, who cares about them? It's the 3 witnesses are what like convinced me. And I would even, you know, when I heard stories about people feeling the plates through the cloth, I was like, that's even less persuasive. That could be anything under the cloth, right? But now, for me, I find all of the witnesses' testimonies really compelling, but I take it in the exact opposite order now. Like, if you want to understand the witnesses, I feel like you got to start on some level with the unofficial witnesses, because they're the earliest interactions with the plates, right? And before there are any like official,
as soon as he first obtains the plates and brings them home.
As he first obtains the plates and brings them home, you have his family. They're feeling them under the cloth, and the descriptions we're getting from them make it really clear. Like once you actually dig into the primary sources, they're not like just weighing, like feeling a heavy rock or, you know, a heavy
or block of wood.
Right, yeah. They're talking about feeling the leaves underneath. They're talking about thumbing the edges, right? Emma specifically talked about being able to hear a metallic rustling sound. A witness we don't talk about a whole lot, Alva Beeman. Martin Harris interviews Alva Beeman before he goes to investigate himself. And Alva Beeman describes like he helped Joseph put the covered plates into a box to hide under the mantle. And he hears the clinking, the jingling, the metallic sound, right? And I think Martin probably also heard that sound. I mean, the interactions Martin Harris had where he talks about feeling them under the cloth, hefting them in a box. There's an account from David Dill where he talks about Martin Harris having them on his knee for like an hour and a half, turning the leaves over as he just talks with Joseph Smith about stuff. And so he's given like a lot of liberty to really examine this under the cloth. And so there's no disputing that
this
Joseph
is prior
Smith,
to his vision of the angel and the plate. Yeah, we forgot about that. That he was his scribe and he would have held the plates as well when they were covered in the cloth.
He has all these experiences, and he has and all of these witnesses, and Alva Beeman left like Alva Beeman didn't leave any accounts, but Martin Harris mentions him, and two of his descendants mention, I can't remember who it is off the top of my head, but we've got multiple primary sources talking about Alva Beeman interacting with the plates. Josiah Stoll is one of the ones that, you know, I find really, really compelling, precisely because his description of the plates is so unexpected, right? He's asked
to testify. Corner of the plates, doesn't he?
Yeah, he's asked in court to testify about Joseph Smith's scrying, right? And this is a trial where the trial is like to prove that Joseph Smith was duping Josiah Stoll, but Stoll himself is actually getting up and defending Joseph. And he's asked about, you know, his experiences and what Joseph has told him about the plates and stuff like that. And he mentions that when Joseph Smith brought the plates home, he had a chance to handle them. And in another source, a letter that he had dictated to a scribe in like 1843, he claims to have been the very first person to handle the plates after Joseph brought them home. But there are other people. Lucy Mack Smith is in some sources portrayed as the first person. Catherine Smith is portrayed as the first person. Joseph Smith Sr. is portrayed as the first person. All of them have these interactions with the plates really soon after Joseph brings them home. So but he says that as Joseph passes them to him, a corner of the covering slips off and he sees a corner of the plates. And he doesn't describe them as like gold loose leaf plates necessarily. He says it looks like a stone of greenish cast. And I think you already know this, right? But to me, that's really compelling because it hints that he's not just like, it's not just a memory that he's made up, or it doesn't conform to what you'd expect if he's making this up or imagining it or whatever.
He probably described them as pure gold.
Yeah, he probably, exactly. That's what he would say if he was making this up. He's describing what he actually saw. And that, I think, really seriously complicates efforts to say Joseph Smith manufactured the plates, because, you know, the common theory, if he made his own set of plates, is that they were tin, right? Tin does not corrode into a greenish color. As far as I'm aware, copper is the only metal that oxidizes and becomes a greenish or bluish color. A stone of a greenish cast is really weird, but like if you think of like the Statue of Liberty, that looks like a stone of greenish cast to me, right? In fact, when I was a kid, I thought it was made of stone, but it wasn't until I was in school or something that I learned, oh, it's made of copper. And so that like and not only is it complicated because now you have to come up with a copper-based source for Joseph Smith to have made fake plates out of. But why are they already oxidized? If he like just barely made these and he's bringing them home, like they should look more like new, I guess. Like
they should look green.
Did Joseph Smith also like treat them in some way to like age them and make them look like more ancient and older and worn out and corroded? Like it's not impossible Joseph Smith did something like that, though I don't know that he had the metallurgical knowledge to do it. But again, I feel like it complicates. You're now having to hypothesize a really complicated thing for what Joseph Smith did in order to account for this source.
What would you say to a critic who might push back that say like all of the other witnesses, including Joseph, describe them as having like the appearance of gold? So Josiah Stoll's more of like an outlier where he says that the greenish shoe. It is interesting.
Yeah.
I know what you're saying, though, that he notes that, but what would you say if someone were to think that?
Well, my first pushback would be, as I already pointed out, it's a really unexpected thing for Josiah Stoll to say.
Mm-hmm.
And so it only makes sense if it's what he actually saw. Like you can't just brush it
Yeah.
aside because it's the only source that says it.
Mm-hmm.
It's so unexpected. It makes so little sense. It to me, there's no other way to account for it except that's what he actually saw. But there's a couple other things. This is a really early source, right? It's a really early source. He's only describing seeing a corner of it. And so if you imagine, the plates may have only been corroded like along the edges, for instance. And so when you're actually looking at the plates and you're flipping through them, and their overall appearance could be golden. And in fact, I think we'll probably talk more about this when we get into
Talk
doing
about
metal plate stuff.
yeah,
But
in
their
part two.
overall appearance could have been golden because the gold would have preserved and prevented the underlying copper from corroding. But if the edges wore off and got exposed, the edges may have corroded. And so since Josiah Stoll just sees a corner, that's all he sees. And so the green really stands out to him because he's seeing such a limited context. But if you're seeing the full set, you're going to predominantly see the golden colors, and you may not care much about the edges having a little bit of green on them or whatever, right? There's also, look, I wouldn't rule out the possibility, because he's actually seeing the plates exposed and uncovered before anybody else. I wouldn't rule out the possibility that maybe they were more heavily corroded when Joseph first brought them home, and maybe Moroni or somebody. I know this is having to import some supernatural explanation because I don't think Joseph Smith has the knowledge to do this himself, but if Moroni can show him where the plates are, Moroni can be like, oh, now you need to clean them because they got corroded over in the 1400 years after they were buried. And there are artifacts that are corroded over, that are copper gilded gold artifacts that are corroded over when they're first discovered. But when scientists, treat them with a safe, like, washing method or whatever, you can peel off all of that corrosion and it still shines like it looks like it's made of pure gold. And so that's not my preferred explanation. I think it's probably just the corrosion is along the edges. And so other witnesses who see the full plates, they just don't care they're not impressed by this little bit of green along the edges, whereas Josiah Stoll just seeing the corner, that's all he sees. But I wouldn't rule out the possibility that maybe they were more heavily corroded when he first brought them home, and then Joseph had to learn how to clean them off and treat them so that they would look more like gold plates. That doesn't strike me as impossible,
Right.
So I find the collective testimony of the unofficial witnesses is really compelling to me because it tells us he really did have, I think, pretty indisputably, there's no getting around the fact that he had a real set of metal plates.
Yeah, there's definitely a plate artifact.
And like I said, based on just the Josiah Stoll source, that has to have some sort of copper component to it. You can't hypothesize like tin or whatever being what it's made out of. You're going to have to come up with a way for him to have made something out of either copper or maybe brass, which would give it a more golden look, right? And those are metals that are going to be harder to get into Joseph Smith's hands. They're going to be more expensive. They're going to be harder for you to imagine him being able to just make a quick and dirty forgery out of. You're complicating the process here when you have to include those metals. But then you have the 8 witnesses who I think are really, really compelling. I don't think you really can make a good case that they only saw the plates covered like some people try to do. And
well, that would be most critics' view. Even when I talk to Dan Vogel, that's his interpretation. And we can maybe talk about a couple of specific quotes, but you hear a lot coming from critics or ex-Mormon voices that they'll typically say like none of the witnesses ever actually saw the plate. So they'll say the 3 had a hallucination, but with the 8, they'll focus on like the Stephen Burnett quote and maybe one from John Whitmer where it talks about like seeing the plate but by a supernatural power, and then they interpret it. Okay, that's their experience. They didn't actually see the plates, but they ignore or omit all of the other statements. And I did a video on this, and I read through Richard Lloyd Anderson's book and other things. And when you look at a lot of their statements, they just emphatically repeat, I saw and handled the plates. I saw the engravings. There's a couple of statements where I think John Whitmer was asked, were they covered in cloth? And he said no. And to me, it just seemed very apparent that, like, okay, even if you don't believe that the Book of Mormon is divine or historical, you still need to represent their testimonies accurately. And I feel like you should not interpret their experience based on like 1 or 2 quotes but ignore the, couple dozen that don't support. But you should interpret it based on the majority of the statements.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So, in typical, historical method would be when you're trying to reconstruct what happened in the past. Yeah, you first of all you need to try and take into account as much evidence as possible. So you need to try and deal with the full range of documents and stuff that are describing this experience.
Right.
But as you do that, and you have to make decisions, interpretive decisions about what is more or less reliable, because it's normal for there to be contradictions and conflicting information in some of those sources. As you do that, the general rule is you're going to give more priority to earlier sources and sources that are firsthand, secondhand if you have to, third hand, and things like that. You're starting to get off into really kind of sketchy territory. And so when you take the 8 witnesses that way, well, the first thing I think has to be dealt with is their statement that's printed in the front of the Book of Mormon. And this is obviously true for the 3 witnesses as well, but the 8 witnesses statement printed in the front of the Book of Mormon, that is the earliest document we have in relation to their experience. It's a first-hand document. All 8 of them agreed to it. They all 8 agreed, this represents my experience. I feel comfortable affixing my name to this. And I know some people make a big deal like, oh, we don't have an original that they all signed. We just have the printer's manuscript copy where it's all in Oliver Cowdery's handwriting. But you have John Whitmer in 1836 saying, I signed my name to this. And you have David Whitmer who says, yeah, all the witnesses individually signed their name. We don't have, that original document was probably stored with the original manuscript of the Book of Mormon in the cornerstone of the Nauvoo house or whatever it was, and got destroyed. And believe you me, I would love it if we had that original document, but we don't. But it's absurd, I think, that these guys had their entire lifetimes. If they felt like this didn't actually represent their experience, they had their entire lifetimes to clarify that. And instead, what they do is they say over and over again, you've got tons of statements, especially from John Whitmer, but some of the others, where they don't give you a lot of additional details, but what they do say is, what that statement says, that happened. That's true. That statement as printed in the Book of Mormon, that is absolutely true. And so I know that you've got people who try to weasel around that statement because we don't have the full historical context of how it was given and what the circumstances were, and maybe they were in different groups and had different experiences, and maybe it's combining different experiences into one, and we can't really trust it. But I think you have these witnesses. They had so many opportunities to clarify that, and they never did. They're insisting over and over again, as stated in that document, that's what I experienced. And that document tells us explicitly they saw the plates, they handled the plates, they hefted them, they had the appearance of gold, they were able to turn the leaves over and examine the engravings thereon. It really is, to hypothesize that they're doing all of this covered when they don't say that, and none of their sources say that. None of their accounts say that. It's like assuming when I tell you I'm going to check my phone that I'm just going to look at it in a box or look at it covered up by something. Like, you wouldn't, if I tell you I'm looking at something or I'm looking at a book or whatever, like, you don't assume there's a covering on it. You assume I'm directly looking at that object. And you have a burden of proof, I think. If you want to say there's a cover there, you have the burden of proof to demonstrate it through the historical evidence, and you can't do that. It's not there in the historical evidence. And yet, like you mentioned, there is at least one source from John Whitmer in an interview where he's asked, did you see, were the plates covered when you saw them? And he said, no, Joseph handed them uncovered into our hands. So, this is, you really have to, again, if you want to hypothesize a fake set of plates to account for all of those unofficial accounts that we just talked about, your theory has to be, it has to be a set of plates that looks passably ancient, that looks passably golden, that has engravings on them. Like, it has to be a pretty elaborate forgery.
Yeah.
Because the 8 witnesses, I think, pretty explicitly saw it. You mentioned there are a couple.
They talk about, they do talk about, seeing fine engravings. So if Joseph did fashion his own set of metal plates, according to their testimonies, I think he would have had to have etched in engravings characters as well, which would have added to the difficulty or unlikelihood of him being able to do that himself. And again, I told you off air that I have a family member who has, lost her faith, left the church. And I think it was after an interview I did with Dan Vogel, I talked to her a little bit about it, and Dan Vogel's theory, which, no disrespect, Dan, I think he's a great scholar, great historian. Don't come to the same conclusion as him when it comes to the witnesses, his interpretation, but it is probably the explanation you would have to go with for the gold plates and the witnesses. And she just didn't find it compelling at all that, or even plausible that Joe Smith would have had the capabilities of making his own set of metal plates. But I said to her, like, well, it's undisputed that there's a plate artifact, so you'd have to go with that. And she just thought, no, like there's no way. Like, where would he have got the metal from? Would have had the skills to make it? Etching in, the character, she just didn't buy it. But then she didn't have an explanation then for the plates. But that is what you would have to go with. And that, to me, I just find highly improbable. Now, playing devil's advocate, so I brought the Stephen Burnett quote, and I can't remember the quote, but you've done an article on it. But he basically talks about how, like, his testimony cracked because none of the three witnesses saw the plates, and then neither did the eight, and that they saw them, I think, covered in a cloth. And so critics would point that and be like, aha, they didn't actually see them. They saw them spiritually or supernaturally. They perceived them second sight through the cloth. And that's what they mean by I saw and handled. And then when John Whitmer talks about, like, I saw it by a supernatural power, they didn't really naturally see it. What would be your response to that?
Yeah, so the first thing to keep in mind is that Stephen Burnett is a third-hand source when we're talking about the eight witnesses. Mm-hmm. He claims no conversations with any of the eight witnesses as the source of his information. It is Martin Harris that he's reporting this from. Martin Harris, obviously an authority on his own experience, which we'll get to, I suppose, as we get to the three witnesses. But the eight witnesses themselves, they can, they have the right to speak for themselves, and we have documents where they're speaking for themselves. So that's the first thing, right? When you're talking about Stephen Burnett, what you're talking about is Stephen Burnett said that Martin Harris said that the eight witnesses said that they never really saw the plates, right?
Right.
And Burnett kind of makes, and you mentioned Dan Vogel, and Vogel has a line in his article or the stuff he's done on the witnesses where he says that he defends his use of this source by saying that none of the witnesses ever contradicted this. And that's something that's just flatly not true. You have to do some mental gymnastics, and I'm just going to call it that. You have to do some mental gymnastics to get to the point where you're interpreting the source material to say none of the witnesses ever contradicted this. There are three claims that Burnett specifically makes about the eight witnesses. One is that they never saw the plates with their natural eyes, right? The other is that they hesitated to sign their official statement. Mm-hmm. And then the other is he claims that when Martin Harris tried to clarify, he never should have said. He says Martin Harris said he never should have said the testimony of the eight was false. And so he claims that it's flat out false. Well, that one we can say is explicitly contradicted because I already mentioned we have tons of sources from different eight witnesses who are explicitly saying, no, the statement as printed in the Book of Mormon that we signed is true. Everything in there is true. You've got them saying that over and over and over again. So the idea that they believed their statement was false, that is false. That's contradicted by the historical record. The idea that they hesitated to sign the statement is contradicted by the historical record. You have John Whitmer in 1836, so 2 years before the whole Burnett thing happens, you have him saying that he had no hesitancy. It's in the Times and Seasons. I don't remember the exact source. I'm trying to find it in my notes here, but I'm not finding it. But you have him explicitly saying, that he had no hesitancy, in bearing witness to it and signing his statement to that effect.
Right.
And you also have these other things, like you have people like Lucy Mack Smith, who's there when they go out to see the plates and then come back. And as an eyewitness of what happened when they come back, she says they testified to this, and then she reprints the official statement. So her recollection of what they testified to right when they came back was exactly what was in, or was at least in essence the same gist as what their statement says, right? And so you have people who witnessed their reactions right after their experience, or really soon after, who kind of indicate that, like, yeah, no, that this is what they experienced, and they didn't seem to be like lacking confidence or hesitant about it in any way. They were immediately bearing witness to it. So there's no evidence, other evidence that they hesitated. They're explicitly denying that. And then the idea that they never saw him with their natural eyes. Well, this is where you get, I think, the most explicit and clear contradiction. You have like right after, just like weeks after this conference thing where Stephen Burnett says Martin Harris said that, you have Hiram Smith, who's the only one of the 8 witnesses who was still in Ohio, by the way. The rest of them were all in Missouri, or who had left.
So they weren't there to dispute it.
They weren't there to dispute it. They weren't, I mean, if you want to say they never contradicted it by directly responding and disputing this, well, they weren't there to do that. And they're going through like one of the most mass, like the controversy, the move of the church over to Missouri, and there's all this persecution they're dealing with. Like, they're dealing with way more. And like, by the time all of that settles and they're in Nauvoo, nobody cares about what Stephen Burnett said anymore, right? And so this idea that, like, well, if they didn't explicitly refute it right after it happened, then they're just agreeing to it. You can't make that argument, I don't think. But the closest one you have here is Hiram Smith. A few weeks after this, he's traveling to Missouri, but he's still in Ohio. He's still pretty close. He might have actually still been in Kirtland when this happened. The chronology is a little fuzzy on that. I found different sources that date his departure from Kirtland earlier than it or later than that, so I can't say for sure. But he's close enough that it appears that word reaches him and his company of travelers what Burnett said. And so he preaches a sermon, and he explicitly says that he says,
like 2 hands, 2 eyes.
Yeah, he said he has but 2 hands and 2 eyes. And he said that he had seen the plates with his eyes and handled them with his hands. And this is pretty clear. Like, and look, everyone I've read, Richard Lloyd Anderson considered this a response to the Burnett claims, the claims of Burnett and his people. And I think Vogel does too. He admits that this seems specifically designed to counter the claim that they saw with spiritual sight. But then Vogel kind of tries to reinterpret it as like he's just saying that that spiritual experience is not less than or inferior to physical experience. But that's not what he's saying. He's explicitly saying, no, it was a physical experience. I have 2 hands, I have 2 eyes, and those are the hands and eyes I handled and saw the plates with. That's it. That's what Hiram's saying. And he repeats it more or less in a letter after going through Liberty Jail. He basically repeats it using very similar phraseology in a letter written just after he got out of Liberty Jail. So he's gone through persecution and suffering, and he writes this letter where he talks about how, he felt the determination to die rather than deny what his hands had seen in his eye, or what his hands had handled and his eyes had seen, right? Like, that quote. I don't know how you can get more explicit in contradicting this and directly responding to what Burnett is doing than what Hiram Smith provided. And of course we could
I really don't think they'd have the same conviction or sure testimony if they perceived it through spiritualized through a cloth.
Yeah, no,
they would make those sorts of statements.
Absolutely. And we could talk about others. We mentioned, like, John Whitmer says he saw them uncovered. He was asked specifically if he saw them uncovered, and he said yes. And the general thrust of almost all of the witness testimony, the 8 witness testimony, is that it was a naturalistic experience. It was ordinary. Joseph Smith handed the plates, and they handled them, and they saw them, and they examined them. And I don't see it. I don't see a compelling case for spiritualizing that.
I was just looking at their first and second hand statements and just the totality of the sources, the documents, the statements.
So you mentioned I have an article on this. It's actually specifically showing how the 8 witnesses' statements are contradicting almost everything Burnett says about their testimony, plus a couple other things he puts in there. And so, look, this is standard historical practice. You've got a third-hand source that makes a claim, and that third-hand source is contradicted almost universally or essentially universally by first and second-hand sources about the exact same event, you're not going to take that third-hand source and reinterpret the first and second-hand evidence in light of it. You're going to do exactly the opposite. And I don't think Burnett is lying or whatever, but I do think he's maybe misunderstanding what Martin Harris is talking about and what Martin Harris means when he says that, you know, that he saw with spiritual sight, and that's how Joseph
it seems apparent that Martin, in other occasions, used the term spiritualize, describing his vision.
Yeah, and I mean, this is maybe this starts getting us into the three witnesses a little bit, but I think the proper historical method here would suggest what we ought to be doing here is, if we're going to use the Burnett source at all, we need to be working in the other direction. So you want to try and understand what spiritual sight means through the Burnett letter by seeing, okay, if Martin thought the 8 witnesses experience was also some sort of spiritual experience, but the 8 witnesses are clearly describing a physical, tangible, explicitly kind of ordinary experience with the plates, then that tells us something about what spiritual sight means to Martin that might not be what we think when we try to use it as evidence that it's just this visionary thing, and might not be what Burnett thinks either, right? And same goes with we could talk about Joseph Smith too, but I think you've got to work in the other direction. You've got to start with the first and the second hand sources, and then use those to try and understand what's going on in the third hand sources.
Right.
And I mean, we haven't addressed the John Whitmer one, right? That one's a little more direct. It's generally considered a secondhand source because it's a memorandum from Theodore Turley, who says, hey, I had this conversation with John Whitmer. It is a little more complicated because we don't have it in Theodore Turley's handwriting. We have it in the handwriting of Thomas Bullock. And Larry Morris has kind of raised some questions like, well, is this Bullock's notes from a conversation he had with Turley, or is he copying from a document Turley originally wrote, or is he getting verbatim from Turley and copying it down? We don't know. So some people like Larry Morris have suggested this should be read as a third-hand source too. More often it's been considered a second-hand source, Richard or Theodore Turley reporting what he heard from John Whitmer.
It's interesting. I remember I found and this was reading through Richard Lloyd Anderson's book, and I found this quote, and it was a letter written by Myron Bond, I think, to the Saint Herald in 1878. And I'll read what it says. He says, old Father Whitmer told me last winter with tears in his eyes that he knew as well as he knew he had an existence that Joseph translated the ancient writing which was upon the plate, which he saw and handled. So that's very much in line with what his testimony is one of the 8 witnesses they saw and handled. And then he says, and which is one of the scribes he helped to copy as the words fell from Joseph's lips by supernatural or almighty power. And in this statement, he talks about, feeling supernatural almighty power as one of the scribes as Joseph was translating. So part of me wonders or theorizes, could the previous quote be perhaps a conflation of John Whitmer's words, where it seems in other occasions he's quite clear he saw and handled the plates, and this quote, it talks specifically about, the supernatural power, but it's when he is the scribe. Don't know what you think of that quote, but that was something that kind of stood out to me as possibly that could be perhaps an explanation.
So yeah, what that Myron Bond source tells us is that John Whitmer is willing to describe events as involving supernatural power, even when he himself is not witnessing anything supernatural, right? And to be frank, like, we would do this today, right? Like, you might go to sacrament meeting or whatever and be like, whoa, I had a really powerful spiritual experience. And some atheist sitting next to you is going to be like, nothing extraordinary, right? Nothing extraordinary happened. You might even describe like receiving the sacrament. Like, I had the sacrament administrated to me by the power of God, because that's what we believe, right? We believe people holding the priesthood are passing the sacrament and administrating to us. But again, an atheist sitting there is going to be like, no, it was just like some 12-year-old kid who like handed you a cup or whatever, right? Like, as religious people, as people who believe in the divine, like, we have these spiritual experiences in contexts where anyone else observing what happens would not see anything spiritual or extraordinary happening. And that's what we see. Like, clearly John Whitmer is just sitting there, he's scribing for Joseph Smith, and he's hearing Joseph Smith dictate words. And in John Whitmer's mind, this is happening by supernatural power. But he's not seeing any angels. He's not seeing anything miraculous, anything that an atheist who walked into the room wouldn't have seen either, right? And so I do think that's relevant. And I think that, you have to take it in context with everything else we have from John Whitmer. Yeah. John Whitmer wrote one of the earliest church histories explicitly, and in that history, in his own handwriting, he says Joseph Smith showed the plates to the 8 witnesses. And so he's telling us with it, but in his own hand, it's Joseph Smith who showed us the plates. He handed them to us. What I actually think is really interesting, that I haven't seen anyone else make this argument before, but I think it's relevant. And in the paper I mentioned that I co-wrote with Stephen Smoot, which hopefully will be published soon. I don't know. It's still kind of waiting with the journal we submitted it to, but
maybe when it is, it could be fun to bring both you and Stephen on to maybe talk about it a little more. But...
Sure. We talk about, we mainly focus on the Burnett letter, but we do an appendix where we talk about this John Whitmer source as well. And what I think is relevant here is Lucy Mack Smith. She's the only one who provides us any kind of historical narrative or context for when the 8 witnesses saw the plates. And she says that all the men are in the Smith house, and Joseph Smith receives a revelation that one of the ancient Nephites has gone and put the plates somewhere in the woods out by their house. And so he leads the company of the 8 witnesses out into the woods, and she says they were shown the plates and they handled them. So she makes it clear they both saw and handled on that occasion, as she understood it. And then the rest of the men went back to the house, and Joseph stayed, and an angel came and took them back. Well, if you're John Whitmer or any one of those other witnesses, right, this kind of, I feel like this reconciles all of the evidence really well, right? What the witnesses experience is they're led out to a place in the woods where Joseph Smith takes the plates and hands them to them. So they're shown the plates by Joseph Smith, which is what their official statement says. It's what John Whitmer says in his history. It's what several of their other statements say. But you're told, oh, hey, I just got a revelation. A divine messenger put the plates out in the woods. Let's go look at them. What are you going to, well, then you're going to understand, like, okay, a supernatural power was involved in showing this to us, even though we never saw the supernatural activity take place. And you also just have to consider, like, just like for like maybe a Latter-day Saint today going to sacrament meeting, they might have a spiritual experience. If you were shown the plates, if someone came up to you and nothing supernatural happened, but you were shown the plates and you knew those were actually the Book of Mormon plates, like, this is a sacred object to us, right? This is a sacred relic. Of course, we're going to have like a powerful, overwhelming spiritual experience. So the 8 witnesses, they would have known that it was by revelation and by some kind of supernatural agent that the plates were put where they were able to find them, or where Joseph was able to find them to show them to him. They probably had an overwhelming spiritual experience when they handled and examined them, but they never saw anything. By all of their accounts, they never saw anything miraculous take place. It was an ordinary experience that, if an atheist happened to join them or came across them in the woods, he would have seen the plates too, and he would have been able to examine them, right? That's firmly how I believe it happened. That's what all the evidence says, as far as I'm concerned. So and relevant to this too, I think, is Doctrine and Covenants section 5, which basically tells us Joseph Smith has no power to show people the plates unless God permits it. And so the understanding of early Latter-day Saints was, if you're being shown the plates, if Joseph Smith shows you the uncovered plates and you're allowed to handle them and you don't like die or whatever they thought would happen if you were unauthorized to see them. The understanding of early Latter-day Saints was that can only happen by God's power. So John Whitmer saying they were shown to me by a supernatural power in a source, which, by the way, says I handled those plates. There were fine engravings on both sides. So he's saying in that same source, he handled them and he saw the engravings, which requires you to see them uncovered, by the way.
Yeah.
For him to be saying that he saw him by a supernatural power in the exact same source where he's pretty explicit, he handled the uncovered plates and saw the engravings, it really complicates any assertion that supernatural power means something visionary or miraculous is taking place. The early Latter-day Saint worldview did not require that. They believed, again, as DNC 5 itself says, that it was only by God's power that you could see the plates, even if it's just Joseph Smith handing them to you, because Joseph Smith doesn't have the power to show them to you unless God grants it. So I don't see anything compelling in the John Whitmer source. You have to read assumptions into what it means to see by supernatural power to jump logically to, we should contradict all the rest of the evidence and say it was a visionary experience.
Right. No, I agree. No, that makes sense. And maybe wrapping up your thoughts on three witnesses. I think that the prominent theory is that they had a visionary mindset. They were believers. They had this magical worldview, believed in second sight, and they all had a mass hallucinatory experience, some sort of a mystic visionary experience. If I'm steel manning, Dan Vogel might say that we can't be certain, although they all claim to see the angel and the plates and other objects, we can't be completely certain that they all saw exactly the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, sure, maybe they influenced each other and how they talked about it over time and all of that kind of stuff. Yeah, here's the thing. I think this is why like I said, I think you've got to take it in the other direction, right? Rather than starting with the three witnesses. When you start with the unofficial witnesses and the 8 witnesses, and you get to the point where we're at in this conversation, where, like I said, I think it's pretty explicitly undeniable from the historical sources that there's a real set of plates, and they really have, they're passably ancient. So if they're a forgery, they're a really complex, a pretty good forgery, right?
Mm-hmm.
The moment you've conceded all of that, the question is why all of this other, like when you're dealing with the three witnesses, like, okay, why the elaborate hallucination? Like, you don't need a vision, you don't need an elaborate hallucination and stuff like that. Like, you've already got like undeniable evidence that the plates exist. Joseph Smith has already shown he can just show them to people under ordinary circumstances. Like the angel visionary thing, you don't need that hypothesis anymore, unless you just refuse to believe there's divine things. But I feel like once you've gotten to this point, you have to start taking that possibility seriously. And there's well, I'll try to go quickly here, but there are a few things I think do complicate that narrative. One is, okay, we've established Joseph Smith really had plates. Now what happened to them? Why are they never seen again after June 1829? Joseph Smith put them out in the woods and buried them and hid them somewhere. And like in all the years since then, nobody's ever found them. I guess that's possible. But it is a little suspicious that there seems to be a real historical artifact, but it is gone. And the historical sources give us an explanation. The angel took them back, right? But you also have, like, it's not entirely straightforward, but there's a chronology to when Joseph has and doesn't have the plates, right? Because after the loss of 116 pages, they're taken from him again and then gets them back. Yeah. And this is something I'm still kind of working on. I don't know if it holds up or not, but I'm kind of, I want to flesh this possibility out. I don't think you can track any of the unofficial witnesses' experience with the plates. You can't date it to the time Joseph Smith says he doesn't have the plates. Mm-hmm. But every time he says he did get them back, you then start to have these unofficial witnesses talking about seeing and handling and feeling them under a cloth and stuff like that. So there seems to be a real tangible object, but it also seems to like disappear and reappear in the historical record, consistent with Joseph Smith's claims about an angel administering them. Now, you could just say he hit him really well, right? And he hit him for a while and then brought him back.
So it's like when he doesn't have the plates, it's like the plates are gone.
Yeah. But yeah, when he says he doesn't have them, they're gone. No one has interactions with him. No one sees them. Nobody, like, and so I find that really interesting. If you want to claim that Joseph Smith just caused a hallucination or whatever, caused them to have this visionary experience, I think you have to deal with, we already talked about Doctrine and Covenants 5. The context of Doctrine and Covenants 5 is in March 1829. Martin Harris comes down and says, I need a greater witness. That's what Isaac Hale says, right? He says, I need a greater witness. I need to see the plates. And so then they get this revelation, and Doctrine and Covenants 5 says, okay, if Martin has faith, he can see the plates. You can show them to him. And in the version of Doctrine and Covenants 5 that we have now, it says, but not right now, or something like that. That was edited, though. That was added to it. We have the earliest manuscript of Doctrine and Covenants 5 is from April 1829. So it's a copy. It's not the original. It's a month after, but it's a copy in Oliver Cowdery's handwriting made right after he gets there in April 1829. And it does not have anything suggesting that Martin Harris was going to have to wait to see the plates. They seem to expect Martin is going to go, he's going to have an experience where he sees the plates, and then he's going to go back to Lyons, because what the whole impetus for this is Martin Harris is told he's got to testify in court against Joseph Smith. Joseph Smith's false claims about having the plates. And so he panics. His wife is the one like drumming up this lawsuit. So he goes back down to Harmony and he says, Joseph, I need a greater witness that you really have those plates, because they want me to testify that you don't. And I need to know that you really do. And so then D&C 5 is received. And according to Isaac Hale, this affidavit he did, he says that they did this thing where they like Joseph Smith then went out into the woods, and Martin was supposed to follow his footsteps in the snow and try to find the plates. Well, this is a really weird, elaborate thing. And Garrett Dirkmott and Mike McKay have suggested that what they're doing is they're seeing if Martin can properly follow the footsteps and find the plates, then they'll take that as it's the Lord's will for Martin to see the plates. My question, though, is if Joseph Smith can just induce a vision like he supposedly does just a couple months later, why doesn't he just induce a vision on Martin Harris now? Like,
yeah, why didn't he do it then?
Why didn't he do it then? For some reason, Martin doesn't actually see the plates. Or if he has a fake set of plates that are compellingly ancient that he can show to the 8 witnesses just a few months later, why doesn't he show them to him then? Why doesn't he show them to Martin in March of 1829? Because there's nothing in section 5 that promises an angel, right? Like, he's got a revelation that says Martin can see him. Martin really, really wants to see him because he's got to go testify in court. You've already created the justification you need to just show the plates to Martin. If you're just making all of this up, just show them to him.
Yeah, why not be a vision or hallucination for him to experience?
And so I think if you want to say Joseph can create visions, and that's what he does to the 3 witnesses in June, you have to answer why he doesn't do that to Martin Harris in March. You have to try and explain that. And you also, like I said, I think at this point, you also kind of have to explain why he's not willing to just show Martin the plates after he's dictated a revelation saying, hey, it's okay for Martin to see the plates. Like,
they could argue they were self-induced hallucinations per se. I think something that I find interesting is both in the Doctrine and Covenants, but also in the Book of Mormon, I believe in the Book of Ether, which is before when the 3 witnesses had their vision, that it prophesied that the 3 witnesses would see the plates by the power of God. And that's like quite an amazing thing for, Joseph, if he's the author, to prophesy and pull off, and just the likelihood of all 3 being susceptible to hallucination, having a mass hallucination that they never deny for the rest of their lives, and reaffirm that they know they saw the angel in the plates. That's pretty impressive and quite improbable that would
it's incredibly improbable. There are 4 predictions if you count Doctrine and Covenants 17, but before the 3 witnesses have their experience, there are 3 predictions that there will be 3 witnesses: Doctrine and Covenants 5, Ether 5, and then 2 Nephi 27.
Oh, that's right.
And then there's Doctrine and Covenants 17, which is the revelation that promises it specifically to David Whitmer, Oliver Cowdery, and Martin Harris. And I don't know, I think people might argue that like it's all that buildup that primes their minds to have this vision or whatever. But I would argue
they're all expecting it.
I would argue that the March 1829 experience with Martin Harris is every bit as like, there's built up expectation. There's a lot of pressure because Martin's got to go testify in this hearing. There's a revelation promising it. I would argue that you have a lot of expectation and pressure being promised here as well. And yet Martin doesn't have a vision. He doesn't induce a hallucination. Joseph Smith doesn't manage to like induce or hypnotize him or whatever. Like, I really do feel like, again, impossible. Does it make it impossible? No, but it complicates the process. Like, you have this historical, you have this stuff you have to account for and try to explain, like, why could it happen in June 1829? Why couldn't it happen in March 1829? And then the other thing I would add on top of that is you have the Mary Whitmer experience.
That's right. She's out milking the cows.
She's out in the barn milking the cows, and I would have to double check, but as I recall, all the accounts make it actually sound pretty ordinary. Like, it's not super miraculous sounding. A man approaches her and talks to her about how she's working hard, and this is a divine thing that's happening in her house. And then he opens his knapsack and she sees the plates and he turns them over, and there's like no like bright light. There's no he's not even described as being angelic. He's just a man with a knapsack. And it's not until like the very end when he like disappears, right? You have this account where no one's like pressuring her to see the plates. Joseph Smith isn't in control to hypnotize her or whatever, right? Like, I feel like the accumulation of all this evidence suggests to me that the plates really are, just like Joseph said, they're beyond his control. He has a real artifact, but he really is not at license to show them to whoever he wants. And he's not even at license to stop someone from seeing them if God wants to, like Mary Whitmer. Like, somebody else is pulling the strings as to who sees the plates and when. And even pulling the strings as to when Joseph Smith has the plates and when, and under what circumstances. And to me, like I said, you can't prove it. You could come up with all kinds of elaborate explanations for all of this stuff I'm talking about, but the moment you start getting this really elaborate scenario, to me, it's just like, okay, it's worth just taking seriously that there's an angel and there's a divine agent, and God is the one who's actually in control of these plates. But you have to believe in God to get there. And so I guess if you just insist God doesn't exist and you don't get books from angels and translate them by miracles, then we have to explain this some other way. But I do think God exists, and I'm okay with books coming from angels. So I find the evidence that that's what happened here very compelling.
Right. Well, Neal, I think this has been a really long but really great discussion. Very in depth, and I really enjoy this, sort of going over some of the evidence for the Book of Mormon, things in the Old World, Jerusalem, Arabian geography. We talk a little about some of the ancient names in the Book of Mormon. We talked about Mesoamerica, convergences, geology, and then the witnesses. And we're gonna do another episode. Probably won't be tonight. It's getting late my time, but we're gonna dive into the metal plates. We're going to look at examples of metal plates in the ancient world, and then we're going to be looking specifically at the gold plates, some of the descriptions, dimensions, and then look at maybe some of the criticisms. How many plates would there have been? Could the text of the Book of Mormon have fit on the gold plates as described? And there's been a recent fair presentation that you've done, came out in the last few weeks. You've been doing a lot of research on it, so I'll put some links to that, and that will be part 2. But if you have enjoyed this episode, please give it a thumbs up, like, share, and subscribe. And I'll put links in the description where you can check out Scripture Central and some of the articles that Neal has done as well. And also link on the interpreter page. You have like an interpreter page with a bunch of articles that you've done, which people can check out. I want to try to read through a lot of them. Do you have any final words before we end this?
No, I'll spare you any further thoughts so that you can be done and go to bed or whatever.
I'll get some food, then I'll go to bed. But no, this has been a great discussion. I've loved the time spent with you, and you giving up so much time to talk about these things, and hopefully it's been helpful to people. And if you have enjoyed it, share it with other people. Don't forget to subscribe, and we'll see you on part 2. Take care. Bye-bye. Thanks everyone for watching this episode. If you've enjoyed it, please give it a like, share it with others who might benefit, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future content. You can also listen to these episodes on podcast form on Anchor or Spotify, and you can follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Check out my website for more content, personal blog, and more. And if you care to donate to support me, you can via my PayPal or Patreon, or through the website. And you can also give donations via YouTube through Super Chats. Thanks for watching Mormonism with the Murph. Take care. Bye-bye.